have this, the Iblis comes to them. And the question is, well, how does Iblis come to them? Is it the snake? Story of the snake, right? The Qur'an doesn't mention the snake. The Hadith doesn't mention the snake. But this comes from Israeliyat. But is there any problem in that? They say, no, just give us other detail. Do we affirm it? Do we reject it? Right? The prophetic advice is no.
We do tawaqquf.
We do tawaqquf. Why? And in the Hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, if you read the other versions of it, the Messenger of Allah actually explains why. He goes, because you may end up affirming something which is false, or you may end up rejecting something which is true. What if I say that's nonsense? We don't have that patience, right? Because the way that life operates now is everything has to come quick, right? The whole thing of shorts, right, and TikTok is crazy. I was in the barber shop yesterday, took my son, and sitting on the side, and one of the guys there, and he's got TikTok on. I think it's one of the TikTok, right? And it's like 5 seconds, and the 10-second clip, he can't wait for that to end.
He's flicking through.
So he's like, oh, that's good, boring. So he's made a decision that something is boring within 3 seconds of a 10-second video. Taking knowledge seriously, don't make that sacrifice. Why do you want to harm your marriage and harm your family and your friends, etc. around you when you're not taking knowledge seriously? So I say, okay, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. I don't want. If you're not taking knowledge, because it's a long term, it's a marathon, right? So unless you're willing to go in for the long run, otherwise you don't have to become an alim, you don't have to become a bahith, a scholar, etc. Right? Historically, Muslims have believed from very early on that the Bible, the text of the Bible here is muharraf, is distorted both in text and meaning.
Yes.
In text and interpretation.
Yes.
Biqa'i is attributed the view, right, by numerous contemporaries, including our next work by Dr. Ali, that he believed that the Bible's distortion was only on a humanistical level, on an interpretation level.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salawatu wa salam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Welcome back to another episode of the Islamic Book Review Podcast with our esteemed teacher, Maulana Dr. Zishan, and myself, Muhammad. Welcome back, Maulana. How's your holiday been?
Alhamdulillah, it's been good.
It's been good?
It's been better for you, I heard.
It's been better for me.
Yeah.
It's been better for me.
Just so people know that our host is married now.
I'm married now.
So all these requests I'm getting from these walis. Right. Just stop now.
There have been none.
There have been none. But in case I heard there was like a potential one, a little rumor going around. That's all I got. But if there are any, he's off the market.
I'm off the market. There's 3 left though. There's 3 slots left. Anyway. So alhamdulillah, we're back and we're going to be discussing the Bible. The Bible and its study, is it preserved? But before we get into that, just some contemporary masala that we want to add in there. Something that was going around Twitter and was released really recently was this new kind of methodology of doing fiqh. It's not called fatwa. It's called metafiqh. So, are you meta-keen? Are you meta-keen on metafiqh?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmad salim wa nusallim ala rasulihil al-kareem. Amma ba'd. You seem very engaged with this topic because
I'm all for women's rights.
I get that. But
I'm a feminist.
Yes, I'm not. Just so people know, I'm not on Twitter, Instagram, anything with those things. So I don't really know what's going on until someone like yourself would show me something. So before we even, so I'm reluctant to talk about it, or I was a bit reluctant to talk about it because I don't know how significant this is. I just saw the document you sent me. Is there a following of this? Are people actually taking it seriously?
People are talking about it.
Okay.
It's been critiqued by a few people on Twitter, whatever.
That's fine then.
And to the point where the author has had a need to come out and respond.
Okay, so I'm not following it, but just as a general point, I'll mention because I'm not following the discussion, and just to also we don't want to make these podcasts about talking about what's viral right now. But just to make a general comment, I think because I read the document, that's what I did.
Yeah.
The document you sent me, I read that document. I read the bizarre conclusions at the end. So the idea here is that fiqh needs to consider, social circumstances, and
which I think every mufti would be trying to, or will be in theory at least attempting to do. But I think what happens with some of these, I won't say movements, but projects rather, which has been going on for years, is that sometimes we, in our own personal life, or the people that we're surrounded, we experience certain form of oppression or certain things that we think are not right. And so when we come and want to tackle a given issue, we are very much looking through the lens of that, the thing that we see as being done wrong to. So that could be, because this is the thing now, is that we always talk about feminism, and this is actually another case of, I'm not saying feminist, she's a feminist, I'm saying the idea is that looking through the lens of women being oppressed, so therefore fiqh needs to change itself, we need to change the way we give fatwa so we can protect women. And a lot of that makes a lot of sense within a circle of women who've experienced oppression. But then, depending on which group you hang around with, I've got numerous people that have spoken to me that are on the opposite spectrum, and they say, no, the actual oppressors are women. It's us men that have it so wrong, right? It's these wives that boss us around and they don't do anything and they have high expectations. And so you have the other side of things. So now, what would meta fiqh look for that guy, right? It would be very different. And we have to be very careful. And I don't know, this seems like this is what this fatwa was suggesting, was that if someone proposes to someone and they say yes, and there's no nikah done, and then they say, I don't want to get married to you anymore, and they don't have a valid reason, the qadi, I think whoever's going to do it, someone's going to come across and say, you can't get married for a whole year.
You're in marriage jail.
Yeah, you're married prison for a whole year. And then furthermore, there's a penalty.
Yeah.
Right. And this kind of very strange thing. But then a person can turn around and say, well, that's great. What if it's the other way around? Does a woman get a penalty as well? Right. And why 1,000? Why 10,000? Why a year? It's such a very strange thing to go down. But it does seem that a person sometimes gets carried away with a narrative, and it can happen very easily. So again, I don't want to talk too much about this specific case because I don't know much about the person. I just read the document and I found the document very strange and the answer is very strange. I think most scholars and students of knowledge, when they read it, at least when they get to the conclusion, they would say this is a very strange conclusion. You can put the link up if you want to.
A lot of scholars, they came out either critiquing it, or the scholars that were that put their names down, or that had supposedly put their names down, they had retracted their names from it.
But the point I want to say is that the reason why we can easily get into it now is because the way Twitter, YouTube, all these things work, they work of algorithms. So what happens is you have one thing is what the YouTube itself want to show you, and then number two is what you watch. You start to get videos that are similar. Similar content gets presented to you. And so when you, let's say, for example, you're working from 9 to 5, you come home with some of the family, you go online, you say, what are people talking about? Well, no, that's not what people are talking about. Those people that you are familiar with, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So you sometimes have a not an accurate vision of the world around you. You think, oh, you know what everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
And no one's talking about it in real life. Like if you should go to people, I experienced this years ago, because we used to say like, oh, there's this massive controversy. And so when I first started coming and teaching in madrasa, I'll come in and say, oh guys, do you know about this controversy? And no one would know what I'm talking about, right? There'd be one guy maybe that's a bit like, no one knows what I'm talking about, but most people have a clue what's going on.
Yeah.
So you can sometimes create certain narratives and say, this is what's going on in the world today. And a lot of it is not an actual, it's not actually representative of what's going on in the real world. So we have to be careful from any side that we don't fall into that. So if that becomes like, there's an anti-women or anti-men, right? Or, everyone is doing, I don't know, if you could do stuff like Islamophobia, whatever it is, right? That we be careful that it's not, that this is what the reality is. It's not the reality that we've created in our little hubs that we create online. And that is something that I think, as a general point, I don't want to talk, I don't know what this person is. I don't know.
Social media is like that, where you end up creating like there's a term for it. It's called a echo chamber. That's the word. It's an echo chamber. And it becomes very easy. You're right. It becomes very easy to form a reality around yourself where you think that this is reality. But it's usually just the loudest voices in your echo chamber telling you what reality is. It's very important to realize that when we are on social
But you can
media.
put the document up,
Yeah.
right? And if anyone is taking the document seriously and they want to actually have a academic critique of it, I'm more than happy.
Yeah.
But I don't. We can actually put it as a separate section. I don't even think we have to talk
Yeah.
about it part of this podcast. But because you wanted to, because I think it'd be nice. I think this was the idea was that before we start a podcast, it'd be like a random question or something else
Yeah.
that people are talking about, and so we can
Yeah.
do that, inshallah.
We can have it as a separate one if there's demand for it.
Yeah, let's move on.
Just as a introductory point now to the actual topic of our podcast and the books that we're going to do, which we'll mention in a bit. There is this concept in Islamic literature, something which the Prophet ﷺ actually mentioned himself, and scholars after him, from the Sahaba, from the Tabi'un, from the Atba'u Tabi'in, and scholars after them as well, they took this on board and they were proliferate, or at least very active in engaging with it, which is the Isra'iliyat, these qisas, or these anecdotes, these stories, these narrations from the previous nations, whether directly from the books that are given to us, or something which they know as being passed down from priests, etc. And the Prophet ﷺ mentions that narrate from them, but don't believe them, don't affirm them, and don't deny them completely as well. Now, what has been, I've mentioned that they were active engaging in it, but what is our understanding of Isra'iliyat? What counts as an Isra'ili thing, a report, first of all? And what should be our attitude when we're looking at, for example, books that are very heavy with this kind of stuff? Like, I remember Ibn al-Jawzi are very active in narrating Isra'iliyat. We'll talk about Isa alayhi salam in his books of tasawwuf and stuff. So what should be our approach? How do we act upon the hadith about don't affirm it but don't deny it? What's the parameters of that?
So inshallah, this I do want to do. There's a number of books that have come out in recent years as well that have discussed Isra'iliyat, and we would want to do something separate on this, just to go, because it's very interesting to see exactly who narrates Isra'iliyat, and there's actually data analysis done now. But you can actually see which Sahaba narrated the most, which Tabi'un narrated, and you have graphs to show when it became very significant and when it decreased. And so there's a lot of studies on this, inshallah, that we can look at. But as a general point, you narrated the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam already. And this is amazing for the Messenger of Allah, which is the fact that in a very simple sentence, we kind of understand our methodology of approach to non-Quranic or claims of revelation or claims of information that comes. But the question comes before we even go into the hadith is that, well, why is there even a need? So this is something that a lot of people make this objection, saying, well, what's the point of Isra'iliyat?
We have the Qur'an and
we have
hadith.
the Qur'an, we have the hadith. Isn't it sufficient? And of course it's sufficient. In terms of, when you say sufficient, to get you to paradise, which is the main goal of every single one of us, is say, well, I need enough hidayah of guidance to get to Jannah. Can I get that via the Qur'an and the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah? Of course you can. It's a similar discussion when you talk, it's not the same, but it's like when people talk about sometimes ilmul kalam. Do I require kalam as an individual to gain paradise? You say, well, no. You just require Qur'an and Sunnah, and that hidayah is sufficient. But that doesn't mean that you can't utilize the subject of kalam or these other sciences, because they have other benefits to it, or other reasons for it. With the Isra'iliyat, the first thing we have to affirm is that the Salaf, so we talk about Salaf here, we're talking about the Sahaba, Tabi'un, Atba' Tabi'in, right? They narrated Isra'iliyat. These are reports that they had heard from either non-Muslims, or most likely it was Christians and Jews that converted to Islam, and then they will inform the Muslims of reports. But why they're relevant to the Qur'an is because the Qur'an has what is known as a subtext. That's what they call it now, right? Subtext. Or it engages with theology and ideas that come before it. So with the Quranic verse, you would have, Allah Ta'ala says about the Christians, don't say three. Right? Don't say three. So we clearly understand here that the Qur'an here is engaging with Christian doctrine. But then when it says don't say three, what is it refuting exactly? You see, because instead of Allah Ta'ala say, don't say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Quran said don't say three.
Which could be any three.
Could be any three. So you want to put Mary in there, Maryam alayhi salam in there, you want to put someone else, doesn't matter. You want to say, no, I don't mean three fully gods. I mean, God is the hierarchy. And Quran says don't say three. So in that one statement, there's a whole host of maybe different type of groups that the Quran is refuting. So the benefit of one being aware of ideas and theologies pre-Islam or during the time of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is that we understand the Quranic argument much better.
Yes.
Why Allah Ta'ala has said something and why He's not said something.
Which is natural. You can't understand an argument without understanding what it's responding to.
100%, 100%, right? So that's the first one. There's a very good book on this, which I mentioned in most classes. It's a book written by a guy called Imran al-Badawi, which is called The Qur'an and the Aramaic Gospel Tradition. And the term that he utilizes, which I really like, and I've said it many times in classes, is he calls it dogmatic rearticulation.
Okay.
That what the Quran does is that the Quran will take on ideas, right? So ideas that are found, let's say, in Judaism, Christianity, or in the Bible itself. And then what it would do is it would rearticulate it and basically sort out the story for you.
Yes.
Sort out the theology for you.
Yes.
Right? And so there's many examples of where the Quran refers to, he gives the example of the Quran refers to Ibrahim alayhi salam as being Hanif. And he goes, why is it called Hanif? Why does Allah Ta'ala affirm him being Hanif and then say he's not Mushrik? So he tries to demonstrate saying the word Hanif, and you go back to a Syriac or Aramaic origin, you'll find that it has a negative connotation to it. So because of negative connotation, Allah Ta'ala affirms him being Hanif and then he says he's not Mushrik. Right? So this is dogmatic rearticulation. That's the term that he uses. So that's a subtext, and it does give us a much more appreciation of the Quranic stories, or firstly the Quranic theology.
Yeah.
What it's refuting.
Yeah.
And then the second, which is probably the most common usage of Israeliyat, is that the Quran refers to stories, and the stories, the details of the stories are not found.
Yes.
So Yusuf being like a bit of an exception to the rule, which is like Allah Ta'ala telling us that you want me to tell a story, I can tell the story in the best way possible.
Yeah.
And then you get the amazing story of Surah Yusuf.
From beginning to end.
Beginning to end. But stories are not like that in the Quran, because usually every story that's mentioned is for a lesson. And the lesson can be had without knowing the information.
Oftentimes the story will be mentioned in a particular way, even if it's the same incident, it will be mentioned a particular way with certain language to give a certain point. Or different points of the same story will be mentioned scattered around to prove that one particular message or point.
And in those stories, you will have a lot of ibham.
Yes.
There'll be a lot of vagueness. It doesn't necessarily tell you what the location. It won't tell you the people. It won't tell you when it happened. Right? The Quran leaves all that vague. And the reason for that is because the Quran is a hidayah. What is it for you to know? If I said to you, this man came, and because the way we write novels, etc., the way we tell stories, you want to have details. So I said, this person came, he had long hair, he had a big head, small body, whatever, right? And now you're listening to that, and now you can picture it. That's how stories are told.
Yeah.
But the Quran is not bedtime stories for you, right?
Just tell you a group of people.
A group of people came because there's an ibrah, there's a lesson. You want to get hidayah from the Quran, so I want to know what is needed for me to know.
Yeah.
But naturally, as mufassirun and people want to, you come and say, okay, what is the story the Quran is actually referring to here? Because usually the stories would have been known, not all, but some of the stories would have been known. And some are clearly in reference to stories that are mentioned by or known to Jews and Christians before. So because of the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam giving us permission to go to them, right, and narrate from them, but not to affirm and reject. But in what affirm and reject, where there's not clear contradistinction to the Quran.
Okay.
So of course, naturally, if a story of an Israeli story comes and it goes against what the Quran is saying, it's rejected. But he's talking about those places where the Quran doesn't nor affirm it nor reject it. So our approach to that is also that we do not affirm, we do not reject.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So that's the reason why most of the Israeliyat will come in. So when Adam alayhi salam, Hawa alayhi salam, the story comes in the Quran, and we have the Iblis comes to them. And the question is, well, how does Iblis come to them? Is it the snake? Story of the snake, right? The Quran doesn't mention the snake. The Hadith doesn't mention the snake. But this comes from Israeliyat. But is there any problem in that? They say, no. Just give us other detail. Do we affirm it? Do we reject it? Right? The prophetic advice is no.
We do tawaqquf.
We do tawaqquf. Why? And in the Hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, if you read the other versions of it, the Messenger of Allah actually explains why. He goes, because you may end up affirming something which is false,
or you may end up rejecting something which is true. What if I say that's nonsense? I don't believe in that. He didn't come as a snake, and the snake is actually described as having legs and having a beautiful animal, right?
Yeah.
That's nonsense. I don't believe in that. But then what if that was true? Then you rejected something which is true, right? So the Messenger of Allah's advice here is that to not engage in that. So the early the Muslims took on that method and said, yes, we'll narrate them. And just one last point is that, so when these stories come in the tafsir literature, Israeliyat is not a masdar min masadir tafsir. It's not a source of tafsir, right? It's a secondary process to give us more detail. So we're not relying, it's a supplement. We're not reliant upon that. Like lugha, we're relying upon language to understand the Qur'an. So that's a masdar of tafsir. The prophetic sunnah, the explanation of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is a masdar. Israeliyat are not.
Okay.
So therefore, if someone wants to do a tafsir and take Israeliyat completely out of it, it's completely fine.
And if you was to narrate Israeliyat, so if you're giving a lesson or you're giving like a bayan or something, and you mention the ayah, then you mention the Israeli report behind that, do you have to then put a caveat there?
You should do.
Okay.
But this is another thing, right? Is that a lot of the tafsir books, and not just tafsir books, books in general, they were written for elite audiences.
Of course.
So you don't have the general public reading these works. So you have ulama reading it. And so some of these reports, the scholars may put in there, but they're not necessarily affirmation. Right? Especially like we spoke about hadith books as well. So just because you find a hadith in a hadith book, you can't necessarily say that this is the madhab of so and so unless there is something clear in the methodology to suggest so.
Yes.
Like we said, the bab towels, etc. Right? But if someone is just collecting information under a given verse and saying, well, this is what's been said, that's not necessarily an affirmation of that.
Yes.
But what happens sometimes is these become common stories and they become part and parcel of the verse itself or of the story itself.
Yeah.
So therefore, when we come together and we start to talk about this, we say, well, this is an Islamic story. Islam says this. And then when you go back and you have to,
climb back up the
ladder and to go back to the original, you say, oh, wait a minute. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never said this.
Yeah.
Right? This was something which was said by this tabi'i. And there was nothing in it that they saw to be wrong, and they narrated it. Right? And that's the first point, right? The second point that I want to mention, because these are not mentioned in the books that we're studying today, that we're looking to today about Israeliyat more specifically, is that in the 19th century and the 20th century, these last 2 centuries that go by, you have the Christian engagement with Muslims. And a lot of these, so what happens, which doesn't really necessarily happen in the past, is because books are accessible now, Islam comes under the microscope, right? Like, oh, you guys believe in this, you guys believe in that. So for example, if you were to look at the story of, Sulaiman alayhi salam, which comes in the Qur'an, regarding his throne.
Yes.
So there you'll find a story which talks about Sulaiman alayhi salam and the ring.
Yes.
He had this ring that everyone was,
I remember learning that or reading it as a child in a stories of Book of Prophets.
So there's the ring, and then the jinn,
yes.
The shaitan, takes the form of Sulaiman when he goes to the bathroom, he wears the ring, and then the whole power comes to him.
Yes, yes.
Sulaiman Islam is not recognized wife, and then in the story it says that the shaitan, he actually has relations with the wives of Sulaiman Islam, right? And then the story goes on. It's quite. So now someone comes, wait a minute, you guys believe in this, right? So in response to that, you have a lot of ulama, some modernists, but some ulama, they say, we don't believe in that. These are khurafat, these are lies. Unfortunately, the Mufassirun mentioned them, right? So we don't want to believe in this. This is nonsense, right? And they want to do what's called tasfiyah, to purify the literature from this.
Yeah.
So you do actually find in the last century, tafsir literature is far less, you find Israeliyat utilized and mentioned far less in the tafsir literature.
Yeah.
That's point number one. Point number two for the decrease of this is that there's been an increase on one side of biblical studies. So now we can actually, not just an increase of biblical studies, but critique of the biblical narrative.
Yeah.
So what Christians believe to be, or Jews believe to be, the words of Moses and Jesus, right? Western academics, most of them not Christians, but some Christians as well, they were questioning the age-old understanding of the origins of these books, the scriptures that we have, of which constitutes the Bible. So as knowledge of that increases, say, wait a minute, our Israeliyat are going back to this, right? This is muharraf, this is fabricated. We can't do that. So then a far more disdain comes in terms of utilizing these scriptures. And this also is exacerbated by the Christian-Muslim polemics.
Yes, in debates.
Because that debate, especially during the colonial period and then post-colonial period, you have this Christian missionaries that very forcefully try to push Christianity onto Muslims and others, and they would start to try to attack Islam. Then in response to that, you get much more of a critical approach back to that. So you get a far more disdain for the citation of Israeliyat. What's correct, but
yeah.
Can I ask something on
that? This is something which one of the authors actually discusses. And I don't want to go into the book too just yet and just ruin it, but he mentions in his kind of introduction where he says that the usage of the Bible when it comes to polemics and stuff is to primarily discredit the Bible, show its invalidity, despite it being affirmed as the word of God.
Yeah.
But because it's just assumed and known to be corrupted, therefore let's prove its corruption. That's the main way we're going to prove the validity of the Qur'an and therefore Islam.
So this is just on this point, this is a describing historical reality. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Now, is it correct or not, right? Or before we go to the Bible, just by Israeliyat or not, this is something which you have ulama still differ and debate about it quite a bit. There's one of the papers that I usually go through in our White Thread course on tafsir, which is written by Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar. He's one of the leading ulum al-Qur'an tafsir scholars right now. And so his paper on Israeliyat, where he argues that, he goes, no, this kind of dismissal of Israeliyat has gone too far. Because the Sahaba, Tabi'un, Atba' Tabi'in, they were citing these stories. And they also had certain dawabit, certain rules. And you will find quite consistently they will apply those rules. When you have sometimes the crazier stories, the more outlandish stories, you should say, right? Or more unbelievable stories, because usually they're not established from the Sahaba. So he's more giving into it. On the other side, as I mentioned, you have scholars that are very much dismissing of these Israeliyat because of especially a lot of the reports that not only are they outlandish, but they have Anbiya putting them into uncomfortable positions.
Yeah.
We'll mention a couple of those, inshallah.
Theologically uncomfortable, like, them doing things or things happening to them.
Exactly. So this is where, so now, what way should you situate? Well, the Prophet ﷺ is quite clear, as we mentioned before, right? So the qa'idah is very simple. So if you want to take a bit more, remember, you can't believe in him. So even those who are not believing in him. But if you want to take a more positive stance to it, no problem. If you want to take a more negative stance, no problem. But what we can all agree upon is that if it contradicts what Allah's Messenger is saying, so even the more outlandish that have the Anbiya doing incorrect stuff, even those scholars that cite them usually will come back and say, well, this is problematic. This is wrong, or they may mention some statements like that. So the prophetic advice, as I mentioned, if it goes against the Sunnah, the Qur'an, the Sunnah, then we reject it. If it doesn't, we stay silent upon it, right? And if it does seem quite outlandish and bizarre, we say it seems like it's not true. The athar of wada' and fabrication is on there.
This is min al-ajaib.
Yeah, and that's what they say normally.
Yeah.
Ibn Kathir's statement is from the strange reports, right? And I think in this actually, is why one of the, I just want to mention the last point before we go on to the books, inshallah, is that it's actually one of the miraculous natures of the Qur'an, is that what it does is it takes a lot of Allah Ta'ala retells the stories of, many of the stories that are in the Bible, and takes away from it those problematic details.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things where Christians struggle to explain, like you have, the 6,000 world young earthers, because you have like a genealogy going back to Adam. Quran doesn't affirm that, right? You have Dawood alayhi salam, na'udhu billah, committing zina in the Old Testament. The Quran doesn't mention that, right? Has Sulaiman alayhi salam doing all sorts of things. Quran doesn't affirm Lut alayhi salam doing all sorts. It doesn't affirm that, and it actually mentions them as being great people, and it tells the stories, but it takes out all of these details and just does tazkiyah of them. So they're amazing people.
Yeah.
In essence, refuting those stories, not even entertaining them.
Yeah.
So a lot of the trouble that others will go into when it comes to to their stories, the Quran retells it and takes away all of this kind of baggage that it comes with, and that's the dogmatic rearticulation that we're referring to.
So just as a point now leading on to the books, just going back to the hadith as well, could you say on this hadith, because this is something which the authors of the book of, I think, of the second book at least, he grapples with that, were the Christians actually charged with tabdeel in the Qur'an and stuff? Yeah.
Let's do. You're gonna ask
So the hadith itself, can we say that this hadith confirms tabdeel of the books that passed?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. Right, we'll come to that, but we'll come to remember this point.
Yeah.
Because when we go to the book, let's start with the first book, inshallah. Otherwise, I think we're touching on the books more and more without mentioning them.
That's fine. So the first book is written by Professor Walid Saleh, who studied Arabic language and literature at the American University of Beirut, and he's got his PhD in Islamic studies from Yale University. He wrote his book, which is titled In Defense of the Bible. And this book, as a brief kind of breakdown of it, he has a lengthy introduction of Imam al-Biqa'i and his Risala, which is titled Al-Aqwal Al-Qawima fi Hukm al-Naql min al-Kutub al-Qadima. And he tries to posit here that Imam al-Biqa'i in his Risala, in his tafsir, where he does a commentary of the Qur'an, these two works show his propensity, if you can use that word, to use the books of nations past to actually prove and explain the Qur'an in a more active fashion than some of his contemporaries. And he tries to posit that this is somehow a defense of using the Bible as an authentic source of explanation for the Qur'an. Yeah. Now, what do you want to add anything to that introduction to the book? I mean, did you see anything that stuck out for you as important points to mention at this stage?
Yeah. So this book by Professor Walid Saleh is actually his PhD dissertation. Right? It's published by Brew in 2008. So it's been around 15 years since publication. And because of the title of the book, it kind of it seems to the reader that it kind of gives away it's in defense of the Bible. So that's not the title of Biqa'i himself. Just in case people are wondering that, because they may think it's a translation of the title. It's not the title. That's his title. He believes that Biqa'i is doing a defense of the Bible. And then Walid Saleh himself has written numerous papers around this book as well. So around Biqa'i, which are not in the, because this is basically a publication of Biqa'i's work with the introduction. Then he's got other aspects of the work that he has studied in other articles, which I think most of them are available online.
He quotes them quite well.
Yeah, you can see a lot of the quotations. And then also he's got other papers that are very good. Walid Saleh, I'm talking about, right? He's got other papers that are very good. One that I commonly use, which again, we will put the name up. I know we didn't do it last time, but we'll do it this time, inshallah. Which is on the language of the Qur'an. So the common Orientalist theory of Qur'an borrowing from other languages. He's got a paper on this, which is very useful. It critiques the whole idea of the so-called Quranic borrowing of words from other languages and the need to learn Syriac and Aramaic and Hebrew to understand the Qur'an. He has a response which is very useful. But this is probably one of the more popular works of his, in defense of the Bible. Because of the nature of it, the topic is just such a interesting topic for people. It's the Quran and the Bible.
Useful for Christian apologists.
Yeah. And the introduction, which is not that long, right? The introduction is not that long. It has a biography of Biqa'i, right? Who's one of the great scholars from Islamic history. He's from the students of Ibn Hajar, contemporary Imam Sakhawi, and others. And he wrote a significant amount of books, but the most famous book of Biqa'i that is known right now, which is utilized amongst people, is his tafsir of the Quran, which is known as Nadm al-Durar, which is focused upon the tanasub, the connection between the ayat of the Quran and the surahs of the Quran. Of course, then, therefore, Biqa'i must believe that the surahs of the Quran are tawqifi. The ordering of the surahs must be tawqif, therefore you can do tanasub between them. We discussed this before, how strong this position is. But a lesser known debate amongst contemporaries is that Biqa'i was also went into another controversy regarding his citations of the Bible in his tafsir. So before we kind of move on here, I just want to explain to a lot of the listeners that what exactly is the Bible?
Okay.
Right? What exactly is the Bible? Because I think those who are already into Christian Muslim polemics, they will know. But I think a lot of our listeners are a bit different. We don't have, well, I don't know who our listeners are, but I assume people listen to the stuff that we've done in the past.
Yeah.
A lot of them, when I ask students as well, they don't necessarily know what the Bible is.
Can I give you my brief
Go for it.
understanding?
Tell me what you think.
And let's see. I feel like I'm kind of at the stage of the listeners as well. So as I understand it, the Bible is a collection rather than a collected codex, kind of, right, of different authors narrating biblical events or stories or the Bible, right, according to their inspiration. So you had different authors, Paul, Matthew, etc. They were inspired to write their narrative of the Bible, and that collection is split into two. You have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the New Testament is what Christians typically use now. The Old Testament was kind of abrogated, so ish, right? And that's a brief kind of thing. You can bounce off of that, I guess.
Right. So this is over here. I've got the Revised Standard Version, right?
Yeah.
Of the Bible. It's just to show, just give an example to people. So what you have when you open the Bible, you have the first 5 books of the Bible, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. You have Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. That's the first 5 books, and this is known as the Tanakh. This is basically the Torah.
Okay.
So when we talk about the Torah, that makes up the first 5 books of the Bible. So if I'm just going to the end of Deuteronomy here, which is the last book of the 5. So this, if you can see there, just to have an idea for the people, that's the Torah, if you like, the first 5 books of the Bible. This is where you have the laws. So laws sent down to Moses, right? You have them here. You know, you want to talk about the hudud. People want to talk about what's the had for apostasy, blasphemy, all that. You'll find it all in these first 5 books.
Cool.
And this is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is more terms used by Christians because the Jews don't believe in the New Testament, so it's just the Testament, right?
Yeah.
So then thereafter, you have all these books written by inspired people, right? Prophets have been ascribed to, and other individuals, and they talk about history, theology, wars, whatever, right? You have this kind of information that comes down, and it's a very large part of the Bible is this chunk in the middle. This also includes the Psalms.
Psalms.
Yeah, the Zabur that we refer to, right?
Yes.
The Psalms of David. It also includes that. You have chapters Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then just so people can see, we have the New Testament.
Okay.
So that is the chunk here.
Yeah.
Is the Old Testament.
Okay.
Like I said, people who know this will say this is like ABCs, but I think it's needed. I think
Yeah.
most people don't know this, right? This part here is the New Testament. Now, the New Testament composes initially, it starts off with the 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels, which in Arabic refers to Injil, right, which we refer to as Injil in the Qur'an refers to as Injil. So the 4 Gospels are accounts of the life of Isa alayhi salam. So there are 4 accounts of the life of Isa alayhi salam. This is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay.
Right, so 4 accounts of the life of Isa alayhi salam. So they, from the New Testament, these 4 accounts, they make up around this much, if you can see, of how much it is. So we're talking page-wise here. That's page, it's very small writing, so don't get deceived by that. So page 1 to page 131, that's the Gospels. Thereafter, the rest of it are letters and other material, which is from the early church and predominantly from Paul.
Okay.
St. Paul. His letters, etc., are found, and other things as well, like Acts of Apostle written by his student Luke. You have all of this, which is like early church history, theology, what's going on after Jesus. But these 4 are the Gospels, right? So that's what the Bible is, right? So when we talk about the preservation of the Bible, the Quranic engagement with the Bible, sometimes Muslims just refer to they will say Bible is Torah, right? Or Bible is Injil, or Bible is all of them. No, the Bible includes Torah, Injil, Zabur, and a lot more as well.
Yeah.
So this book that you have would have much more than those 3 terms ascribed to.
Yeah.
Then the question is that the main question here is that, is the Qur'an, when it talks about Torah, talks about Zabur and Injil, is it what is being referred to in this book?
Yeah.
Right? So when we talk about in defense of the Bible, is Biqa'i defending the fact that this book here
It's the same one.
is the one that was
Yeah.
sent to the prophets and what the Qur'an is affirming.
Yeah.
Now, before we so that's understood. Any questions?
I think that's understood. I think so. As I understood it, you have the first part with so chapters. I can't remember the names, but the chapters that's the Old Testament. You have a big chunk in the middle.
Yeah.
That is your a lot more to do with
just to make more sense to you, for students of hadith. Right?
Yeah.
So when if you have the story of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam with the Jewish man and woman committed zina.
Mm-hmm.
And so they come to the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to say, give hukm.
Yeah.
So he goes, no, we'll go by the Torah.
Yeah.
So then the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam sits there and Abdullah bin Salam is with him and they bring the Torah.
Yeah.
And also there's respect for the Torah. It's put on a cushion, right? Mm-hmm. So he's put, and he says, read. And as they're reading, they miss a section.
He puts his finger over
puts a finger over it, right? Yeah. And he misses a section. And Abdullah bin Salam goes, no, there's a section. He's missing a hair, right? So they're trying to cover up. They don't want the zina, the had to be given to them. They say just black in the face and I think put on a donkey or something, right? But they try to cover it up. So what they would have presented at that time would have been some form of maybe whatever language it would have been in of the first 5 books of the Bible. So what it would have been exactly, we don't know, but meaning it would have been
something from there,
something from here.
Yeah.
Right. So those, because the verse of the punishment for zina of stoning is in the Bible.
Yes.
And it's in the first 5 books, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, that would have been something accessible to them, right? So now, when we're talking about tahrif, right? This is where we're gonna. Now we can only have that conversation now. Once you understand what that is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So now, what Walid Saleh, his arguments. Let's start there. What do you make? Or what is his arguments first?
So there's no arguments Walid Saleh in this book, to be honest, right?
Yeah.
I just think the title is a bit suggestive.
Yeah.
Right? But I think let's talk about the book itself,
okay,
and then we'll come back to the topic, because I think his introduction doesn't have much to do with. It's more of a historical introduction, right? Yeah. So you have the history of the tafsir of Imam Biqai, Nadm al-Durar. He discusses this in great detail. Just to move off topic a bit as well with this, because his introduction is very useful in terms of history writing, is that the Mamluk era, mentions many times now, the Mamluk era was every single hadith scholar was a historian.
Yeah.
Right? We mentioned this before, I believe. And so they all have history books. So we actually have a very detailed accounts of these people.
Yes.
Right? We actually know who the stories about even their personal life, right? Where they taught, fights, all sorts, right?
Yeah.
It's very well documented. Yeah. And so when he provides and I think a lot of students of knowledge, we don't engage in the history, so because we are more interested in the science itself. So when it comes to Biqai, we want to know about Nadm al-Durar. We want to know his book on Mustalah Hadith, or we want to know like that, right? That's what we're interested in. Yeah. When it comes to history, that's usually the section like the Halat Musannif is in Urdu, right? Yeah. It's something that we read briefly and we move on. Yeah. So we don't know much about that. So it's actually quite interesting for the student when they read this. It's like, what, all of this was happening? And we also find, in quite some detail, just beyond that, is like the way he wrote his tafsir.
Yeah.
And I think this is very useful for students of knowledge. So if you read the section from page 21, where he talks about the Qur'an commentary and the Bible controversy, in the beginning he talks about his methodology, how he wrote Nadm al-Durar, his huge tafsir.
It was very planned. It was not planned, but it was gradual.
Yeah, it's a gradual process, and it was taking something in years to complete. And it's something that I think we could be, take inspiration from, is the fact that these huge books, they were not the makeup of a person spending 3 weeks and just writing away. These are long-term projects that what you do is you kind of teach part of your books, you do lessons and courses, whatever you're doing, right? And then the plan is by the end of 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right? You conclude with this book, that is masterpiece that you worked on. And then you present it. It's something that you require steadfastness for, consistency for, and I think a lot of us struggle with this for 2 main reasons. I think students in the West, talking about speaking English, it makes sense to give advice to students in the West, is that number one is that we don't have that patience, right? Because the way that life operates now is everything has to come quick, right? The whole thing of shorts, right, and TikTok is crazy. I was in the barbershop yesterday, took my son, and sitting on the side, and one of the guys there, and he's got TikTok on. I think it's one of the TikTok, right? And it's like 5 seconds, and the 10-second clip, he can't wait for that to end.
He's flicking through.
So he's like, oh, that's good, boring.
Yeah.
So he's made a decision that something is boring within 3 seconds of a 10-second video, whatever it is, right?
And he'll go for about 100 clips.
And within that, the span of like 20 minutes, right? Just flicking through.
There's a term for it. It's called doom scrolling.
Doom scrolling. That's
Because it's just like an endless scroll. Because that feed doesn't end. It just keeps feeding you content.
And it's very problematic, right? Because you just want to get that satisfaction very quickly. You want to laugh. You want to watch something, right? And it was just funny because he was doing that, and I was finishing off reading the second book of Dr. Professor Ali. And so it's just a difference of, you know, and this requires so much thinking and patience. That's just guy just having the time of his life, right? Just flicking through, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that there's no achievement of that. It's very hard for someone to actually, you know, get something done because it's just
that dopamine is in 10 seconds and it's gone.
Yeah. That's number one. Number two, I think, is that Allah knows best about this, but I do think that life in the West is much more busy.
Yes.
You're much more crammed, much more hours you work. Marriage requires much more effort. So when people are married, it's not an idea of like, okay, you do your stuff at home and I'll go work and then we do our own. No, that person's your partner, someone you have to give a considerable amount of time for. Kids, you can't let the kids go out and let the community, as I said in the past, the village bring them up. It's very much, you know, hands-on parenting. So trying to earn living in what place you are. And then not only that, is that things that are considered to be necessities, which are actually luxuries, you have to maintain that requires a certain amount of income you have to have. So you have to work harder for that. So, you know, people sometimes may think that from my necessities is I need to have a, I don't know, Sky Sports or something, right?
Yeah.
And that will be an extra 78, and what's the price now? £60? £70, right? £70 a month, right? So now you have to, and that's just one thing.
Yeah.
Where someone likes, oh, well, I like watching movies. So this guy wants to have a account for something else, right? The £10, right?
£10 subscription.
So just what are
you're
necessities,
up to,
and then you got your internet connection, right? All of that. So without considering much, £150, £200 a month is going on necessities.
Yeah.
Right.
But they're
And
actually
so
luxuries.
Luxury, and you have to then maintain that lifestyle. So you have to work a certain amount. So as students of knowledge, we really struggle with this because even if you're not into it, you may have a wife that's into it.
Or just family members,
Right.
like everyone
And that's
else.
the thing. People normally ask, they say, how do you do this reading? All right. Or how do you, you know, spend that much time? I was like, alhamdulillah, a lot of it comes down to my family is being very understanding. My wife not being someone that is trying to live this idealized fake lifestyle that people present. And if you have a partnership like that, you actually have much more time than you actually think you do.
Yeah.
You can actually get so much more done than you actually. An hour of serious reading, an hour of serious writing is a considerable amount of time. But think the last time you actually sat seriously for an hour even. Sounds very simple, a bit of an hour.
You can get a lot done.
Get a lot done.
There's an interesting thing that I experienced, right? Was something which I had the same issue with. I was like, you know, how I'm finding it very difficult to really dedicate time to read and make sure I study properly and whatever. But when I realized that I actually have more time than I think I do, is when I went into itikaf. And that kind of, I wasn't doing anything special, but that time away from the dunya and also a concerted effort to stay away from my phone and stay away from my gadgets and whatever not, that actually made me realize 24 hours is a long time.
A long time.
It's a very long time. And you can get for a lot.
It's not necessarily, like, you know, a lot of times these are karamat. Of course,
Yeah.
karam means what? It's the karam of Allah Ta'ala, right? Blessing Allah Ta'ala on you. We completely affirm that. But it doesn't have to be some sort of, you know, kharqul aada, that their hours were just longer. Of course, they were more blessed, but naturally when you're in i'tikaf, your hours are more blessed, so Allah Ta'ala makes that more worthwhile. But you have kuffar doing immense work, right? And the reason for that is because it's not necessarily getting the same barakah in time, it's because they're utilizing that time. So there's actually, materially, it's a long time.
Yeah.
You can actually get a lot done. So when students make this kind of excuse, I do get it. Life in the West is hard. I would say two advice for that is if you're taking knowledge seriously, if you're not taking knowledge seriously, don't make that sacrifice. Why do you want to harm your marriage and harm your family and your friends, etc., around you when you're not taking knowledge seriously? So I say, okay, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. I don't want. If you're not taking knowledge, because it's a long term, it's a marathon, right? So unless you're willing to go in for the long run, otherwise you don't have to become an alim, you don't have to become a bahith, a scholar, etc., right? But if you want to take it seriously, two things you do is that things that you consider necessities, right? Actually consider other necessities and have sacrifice those if need be. So if that means that you need to, you're spending X amount of money on clothing and you can't buy the books, that's your problem.
Yeah.
Right? It's not books are too expensive. It's when you're spending too much.
Something has to give.
Something has to give, right?
Yeah.
And then number two would be that the time that you're actually wasting, consider how much time you spend on your phone, how much time you're just on YouTube doing nothing, watching nonsense things. Sometimes friendships that you don't need to have, right? Like you have to have these get-togethers every week with your friends, and you're not doing anything, right? How much of that time is going there? And if you're doing all of that well, and then you're not progressing, then we can have a conversation after that. Until then, there's no point of giving advice. People ask, I want to have advice, how can I excel? And you say, are you doing these? No. Then there's no special, thing. There's no,
It's required for a solid foundation.
So I think that's very good. If you read the life of Bikai, not just him, just because that's what we're talking about right now, you will see this long-term aspirations, high goals.
Yeah.
Right. That's another aspect, right? That all of these guys were. So that he starts off his book, the introduction. It's quite funny. I'm uncomfortable with it, but he says the first thing he says in
the language sometimes they use about certain scholars. You think the language you would use is more like he had a lot of ikhlas and whatever not. But then some of the language they use is that they had aspirations of dunyawi tendencies. That's the language.
So he starts off, he goes, Mamluk Cairo of the 9th Hijri century was a crowded city. So many illustrious names, so many big reputations, and so little modesty.
Yeah.
Right? And the reason for that, what they call modesty, remember, because he's not talking as I don't think he's talking as an alim here, right? In the sense of a traditional alim that also does tarbiyah, not just knowledge. Because our understanding of ilm is imparting of ilm is not just information, is a form of bettering you as a person, right? That's the idea of tarbiyah and ta'lim. So I don't think he's taking up the role of that. But when people say modesty, there's a fine line between kibar, right, or the lack of modesty, or kibar, and tahdith bin ni'mah. So a lot of these ulama, they would refer to themselves as having great achievements, and we would understand as being tahdith bin ni'mah, that you're basically describing the ni'mah of Allah Ta'ala on you. And even though it may seem like that, but we do husnul dhan with great scholars, with great figures, right? So if someone that you know is a great person, they're sitting there saying, I've done this in my life. If they're all factually correct, then and they do tahdith bin ni'mah, that can actually be the opposite of kibar. Why? Because kibar is when you attribute that to yourself.
That's Allah.
If you're saying that Allah Ta'ala has given me all of this, then you can be praising all you want, and it's actually a reward because it's Allah Ta'ala's who the action is being attributed to.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times when we read these kind of things, I read it, you kind of feel a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So that's number one.
It kind of impugns the ikhlas of the scholars that we kind of revere, etc.
And number two is when you read the introduction to this work of Bikai, you'll see that he talks about the controversies that Bikai was in with his contemporaries. And I think there's two things we can learn from this. Number one is that scholars in the past, right, were human beings, and so therefore
they will behave as human beings.
Yeah. Right? Because remember, when we talk about Bikai, let's get another famous name, Imam al-Tabari, Imam Abu Hanifa, right? They were actual beings. They woke up in the morning, right? They sometimes may have got grumpy. They may have sometimes been, in a good mood. Some change of moods may happen. Some may have angered them one day, etc. Right? These are very natural human behavior.
Yeah.
Right? We go back to Sahaba even, right? These are real, because sometimes we kind of forget that these are real people that actually had 24-hour days that they were working through.
Yeah.
So we kind of, rightly so, we have this in this high pedestal, but we sometimes forget that the human aspect of it.
Yeah.
And the negative of that, the positive, of course, is the greatness that you hold and the reverence you have. But the negative sometimes is that you never see yourself of being able to relate to them because you've made them not relatable.
They become malaika.
Exactly. So then you can't, like if I said to you, be like Jibreel, you'd be like, how can that happen, right? I can't be like Jibreel. But then if I say, well, be like this Imam, and you hold them the same right, you say, I can't. That's too much. That's why I like talking about modern history. So when we talk about like the Deobandi scholars we saw last time, right? The likes of Alam, Anusha, Kashmiri, you can't make much of an excuse. Why? Because they lived in a land in charge of by British. So they were colonized people. They lived less than 100 years ago, they passed away. So we're talking about, a bygone age. So they're living under kuffar, right? Not too long ago. And they achieved all of this. So therefore, we can actually look at these people and say, okay, something is achievable. So sometimes the reverence is very important, but you don't. The reading of this kind of realizes the very human aspect of them.
Definitely.
That's number one. And the second aspect I believe is very important is that it tells you how controversies through contemporaries, and it's something noticed very early on in the field of Jarh wa Ta'deel, is that mu'asirin, the people that are contemporaries of one another, don't take their criticism of one another.
Yeah.
Right?
It's often distorted.
And despite them being great imams, we have to be careful.
Yeah.
So when we look at someone like Imam Sakhawi as a great imam, student Ibn Hajar, Imam Biqa'i, another great Imam Ibn Hajar, we just look at them as being great figures, but when you hear about their the clash that they had, the words they used for each other, you think, I don't. You may end up thinking, I don't respect that, right? And you may come out with a negative reaction to that. And we have to remember that this is how human beings have been doing, and this is something that we can then take ibrah from, take lesson from, and say, amongst ourselves, when two people are fighting and they're debating, and we're trying to cover it up in the guise of Islamic scholarship. So I say, no, I don't hate you. I just don't like what you wrote here. But when you actually read the content, you think, no, you actually hate the person, right? And so even though I've convinced myself, but that can happen. So that's why I think it's important that when you read these kind of histories, so I like it and I dislike it as well, because sometimes I think the impact of reading this kind of history of Biqa'i's life, because of controversies, it can remove the reverence of these individuals.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it's important. So if we can situate the conversation properly in our mind and understand what human beings are and what they're like, and this actually applies to even Sahaba, right? Because sometimes when we'll do some books about Sahaba, inshallah, there's controversy about certain Sahaba in the future, is that when you have that image of even Sahaba, and then a hadith, someone brings out, you know, this Sahaba did this. Hatim ibn Abi Balta'a, he done X. You think, what? A Sahabi? He's a Badri Sahabi? He did such a thing? Right? And the problem isn't the Badri Sahabi. The problem isn't the story. The problem is you.
The perspective you're looking at.
Because what you've envisaged that person to be is impractical. It's not human-like to be like that.
Yeah.
And it can even sometimes go to the Anbiya.
Yeah.
Where people sometimes they envisage the Anbiya. Remember, the whole purpose of a Nabi being sent to us was because angels were not practical to follow.
Yeah.
It's for iqtida purposes, for following purposes, right? So you put even Anbiya sometimes beyond what they should. Then when authentic narrations come, I don't accept that.
Yeah. Because
authentic hadith, I don't accept that.
Because almost like a stage up. So the Anbiya become like Malaika.
Yeah.
Sahaba become like Anbiya. They become Ma'soom.
Exactly.
So they can never make mistakes.
So then because your image, and although it is in a nice place, reverence, if it's misplaced, it can cause great doubt to a person.
Theologically,
yeah. I've heard maybe like, and then you jump with others. So you have a person that sometimes it'll be like reverence of every single Sahabi. And then they say, the truth came to me. And I realized that it wasn't what I was taught. And now they become saying all sorts of stuff about Sahaba. Not understanding that your initial position was incorrect. Therefore, your counter position is also incorrect.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's important. But at the same time, I do think, it should be read with more care. And there's a number of works written on the Mamluk era.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting paper written by Yusuf Rappaport, which discusses the marriage of Ibn Hajar. Is basically his marriage life. It's, I also think it's a good read, because you understand, again, Ibn Hajar as a human being. And again, it's not like if someone says, why you bring this to this is written by a student, all right? It's actually documented by a student. So it's not like you're bringing out personal information. It was documented for public consumption. And they didn't actually see anything, because it's written in praise for Ibn Hajar, right? So they didn't actually see anything negative with it. But this is there, right? And he does a great detail regarding his life and times.
Let's move on to, I don't want to take up too much time. We have the next book as well to do, right?
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. So the actual Risala that Imam Biqa'i wrote in response, you can say, to people who were detractors against his usage of the Bible, he wrote his Al-Aqwal Al-Qawima fi Hukm al-Naqli min al-Kutub al-Qadima. And this book, it's short, but it has a lot of detail in certain parts. So he starts off the book with quoting other ulama who he has sent his work to.
Yeah.
So he'd sent his work to a number of ulama across the Muslim world, and he said, what do you think? And he's in there would be his quotation from the Bible, whatever. And they had actually praised his work, and then they had praised his usage of the Bible.
Yeah.
And he kind of builds his arguments off of that first, that this is...
Because that's where the controversy started.
Yeah.
And the question is that you mentioned Israeliyat, and we also affirmed that the early tafasir have Israeliyat. So why was Biqa'i embroiled in a controversy? Because that's where this book comes from. The why Walid Salih writes, he goes, it's a controversy.
Yeah.
And he mentions the background of the controversy where people start saying, well, you're quoting from the Bible. The difference with Biqa'i, his tafsir and the earlier tafasir, and where this kind of embroiled in this controversy was that he wasn't basing his Israeliyat on early tafsir books as was being done. So for example, right now, the Sulaiman alayhi salam qissa, of the khatam, or the ring, right? I'm taking that from where? Tafsir al-Tabari.
You're taking it from a scholarly authority.
Yeah, Tafsir al-Tabari. But then where did he get it from? It would have been from usually oral transmission from some Christian or Jew that became Muslim or whatever, right?
Yeah.
What Biqa'i does is he goes, well, if that's fine, I'm going to go to the Bible itself, right? I'm going to open up the Bible, I'm going to read through it, and I'm going to cite from the Bible directly.
Rather than relying on the assumed intiqa of previous authority.
100%. So now what happens is if you read his tafsir, and that's the thing, because his Nadm al-Durar is the main purpose of the book wasn't to cite from the Bible. The main purpose is to tanasub, it's about connections, right?
Exactly.
But then when you go to any verse which talks about, let's say, Isa alayhi salam, he's actually quoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? He's actually quoting them. He's saying, in the Gospel of Matthew, it says this. In the Gospel of John, it says this. And in the Injil of so-and-so, it says this. He's actually citing from it directly. When he's talking about the Old Testament, he's actually citing from the Old Testament directly. So it's an actual usage of the Bible, which was something that was not commonly done or hardly done in the earlier tafsir books. So the controversy that, so in one place, Walid Saleh, he refers to this, he goes that, he goes on page 32 in the introduction, he says, where's it gone? Oh, here we are. Because after a clash at a chance meeting, Ibn Qattan realized that he needed help of a more seasoned scholar to attack Biqa'i.
So you use Sakhawi.
So he gets Sakhawi to write a work which is called Al-Asl al-Asil fi Tahrim al-Naql min Tawrat wal-Injil, which is a prohibition, the book, the title suggests, of writing the, copying from, from citing from the Tawrat and the Injil. This book is not available, so we don't exactly know what he was arguing for, right? Which presented the traditional position of the Sharia against the use and reading of the Bible. Again, the traditional approach of the Sharia is suggested by Walid Salih.
Yeah.
But the whole point of Biqa'i is to say, no, my position is traditional.
Yes.
Because the second you allow Israeliyat,
Yes.
both of the Israeliyat are taken from the Bible.
Yes.
So then why can't I cite from the Bible directly?
Yes.
So although it may look like a novel thing that Biqa'i is doing, it's actually just standard Israeliyat.
Which he's arguing and saying that this is the traditional position.
Right. So that's point one. So there, I don't think what he said is completely accurate in the way he presents that. Although there's not much claims to be made here, so there's not much to respond to. But the reason why I chose to discuss this is because of the next book as well that we're looking at, is that Biqa'i is normally used, and I think a lot of the times it's because people don't actually read his work. They read the title and they think that Biqa'i defended the Bible, and now we're going to some of these terminologies now. You have what is known as tahrif, right, which is the distortion, but the distortion can be taken on two levels. You have hermeneutical distortion and you have textual distortion. Hermeneutical distortion is that I said, I want to go to the shop, and you know that I was looking to go to a restaurant. But you distort that and say, no, the shop here actually meant he wanted to go to Tesco's or whatever, right? So you distort, it's hermeneutics. The text, I did say that, I want to go to the shop. That's not a problem. But the way you've interpreted that is where the tahrif, the distortion is taking place.
It's an interpolation.
But no, it's a hermeneutical interpolation. So it's not, the text is not changed. It's interpretation that's changed.
Fine.
Then you have textual distortion, where what you do is, when I say I went to the shop, you say, I said I went to the restaurant, wherever you want to distort. There is textual distortion.
The words are changing.
The words are changed. So that's what we call, that's tahrif of the alfaz. What the tahrif lafzi, if you like, right? The actual words are muharraf, are distorted. So historically, Muslims have believed from very early on that the Bible, the text of the Bible here is muharraf, is distorted both in text and meaning.
Yes.
In text and interpretation.
Yes.
Biqa'i is attributed the view, right, by numerous contemporaries, including our next work by Dr. Ali, that he believed that the Bible's distortion was only on a hermeneutical level, on an interpretation level, not on a textual level.
The lafz was preserved.
The lafz was preserved. So that's what Allah said, but the way they interpreted that is incorrect. And we'll talk about the New Testament for this in the Gospels, inshallah, right? So what Biqa'i does is basically a defense of that, and therefore he cites from the Bible with authority.
So the Bible for biqa'i is an authority.
It's a masdar.
Masdar, exactly. Is that correct? Right? I don't think it is. I don't know how one can conclude with that, because if you look at the Risala itself, so for those who don't know, in so it's an introduction, and then the actual Arabic is published in the Bro. So it's a publication of the Risala itself.
It's the full edition of the book.
Yeah. So biqa'i, for example, and this is on page 82. In the very beginning, he's actually justifying his method. He says, بل لا شك عند من له أدنى ممارسة بالعلم أن من المقرر عند حملة الشريعة من أهل الفقه والأصول أنه إنما يسوغ الرد على المخالف بالمتفق عليه، أي بأن يكون ملتزما له أو يقوم الدليل عقلي عليه. ولأجل ذلك أرشد سبحانه إليه، فإنه لو استدل عليهم بكتابنا ما افتضحوا عند غير المسلمين مثل هذه الفضيحة العامة عند كل ذي عقل. He goes that it's known that when you're arguing with someone, that you should cite something that they would agree with. So if I'm saying to you, you're wrong as in not being a Muslim, and you're wrong, why? Because the Qur'an says so, they would say, I don't believe in the Qur'an, right? So you cite something that they would consider as a source or a rational argument, because rational argument doesn't need sources, right? It's rational. So that's my method of how I cite the Bible. Is multaziman, is because they are multazim, they hold on to the Bible, so therefore I cite them in refuting them, right? Or I cite them to affirm something the Quran affirms. So then he goes on to give numerous evidences for them, and his seventh fasl, I can't remember exactly, right, is actually on the section of, on the discussion of, is the Bible changed or not? And under that, he approvingly cites Ibn Hazm as saying, Ibn Hazm says that in the Bible there are stories. So in the Old Testament, there's stories about Anbiya which are not befitting, which are lies. So if, for example, we are to believe that let's say not the whole Old Testament, just the first 5 books is the Torah. In Genesis, the first book, you actually have the story of the daughters of Lut alayhi salam, getting their father drunk and then sleeping with him and getting impregnated. Both daughters are over 2 nights, na'udhu billah. All right? And we seek refuge from such a thing. And that comes in Genesis, in the first 5 books. Right? In 2 Kings, which is a later book in the Old Testament, you have the story of Dawood alayhi salam, who is said to have committed zina, na'udhu billah, with a woman that he saw. Right? And then he tries to get her husband killed.
The general.
Yeah, the general killed. So that's mentioned in 2 Kings in the Old Testament. Biqa'i, if you go to the Qissa of Dawood alayhi salam in the Qur'an, the story of the 2 angels that come into his mihrab. And that story seems to be alluding to the story in 2 Kings. But the Qur'an doesn't mention any woman. Right? So Biqa'i, aware of that story, calls it a lie in his Nazm al-Durar. So if the Bible was preserved according to Biqa'i,
he wouldn't have called it a lie.
He wouldn't have called it a lie, because that would have been, the text would have been preserved, it would have been an interpretation error. He would have said, no, zina here, na'udhu billah, means something else. But he's saying it's a lie. Likewise, if this is the idea that, let's say it's the first 5 books, then one must believe that the daughters of Lut alayhi salam committed zina or incest with their father. Na'udhu billah. Right? And then you must have to explain that. So Biqa'i is not on this madhab, and there's many other stuff as well, right? But the Biqa'i is not on that madhab. Second evidence is, someone may say, what about the New Testament? The Gospels of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you go to the ayah of the Qur'an about the crucifixion, Allah Ta'ala says, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. They did not kill him, they did not crucify him. Now in the New Testament, right, it quite clearly affirms, the Gospels rather, they affirm the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus was crucified. The way Biqa'i has a long section, he has a diatasron is called, which is basically the Gospels, right? The Gospels, they are 4 different accounts. A diatasron is where you basically make it into one account.
One whole narrative.
One whole narrative, and you merge the Gospels together.
One meta-narrative.
So it's called, fair enough, right? So you bring all that together. So he actually has a separate, apparently, Walid Salih has written a work on this where he actually mentions that he had his own version of the Gospels like that. So there's a long section where he mentions the whole crucifixion story from the 4 Gospels. At the end, he concludes, he goes, in conclusion, based upon the New Testament, the Gospels, they did not witness the actual crucifixion. Therefore, what Allah Ta'ala says is correct.
SubhanAllah.
That's not affirmation of the text.
Yeah.
That's saying that they were following dhann.
Yeah.
In the Gospels, their conclusion of crucifixion was a dhanni conclusion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
If that was the Injil, they were the actual Injil, the Qur'an is affirmed, and that's what you're trying to affirm, then he would say that no, it's not affirming the crucifixion. He's saying, no, their belief the crucifixion was based upon dhann. That's what Allah Ta'ala is saying they got it wrong.
Yeah.
Therefore, the Injil can't be this Injil, because Injil is what? Kalamullah.
Yes.
So, Biqa'i does not hold this view from my reading, right? You can read the text itself.
Yeah.
It's there, it's available, right? He doesn't hold this view. So this, the purpose of actually this review was just to highlight this main point. And I do think that it's kind of made into a bigger thing than it actually is. The Bible controversy that he's citing it, I don't think was much of a, maybe in this day and age it was a controversy, but it's not something that is something new, significant point that Biqa'i's made. But where he's significant is the fact that he's actually using the Bible rather than Israeliyat.
Yeah.
And in theory, both is the same.
Yeah, exactly.
In theory, both will be the same because you don't have an isnad for those reports from the Tabi'u Sahaba where they got it from. And likewise, this is actually from the text itself. So whether that's more authoritative or not, that's something that someone can debate.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's just as a summary of this, inshallah.
So that leads nicely onto the next book that we're going to cover, which is written by Ali Ataie, as some people have said it.
Ataie, I believe.
Ataie.
Ataie.
I thought it would sound like Ataie in Arabic pronunciation.
When you said that yesterday, it made much more sense to me.
Yeah, because I don't know, it just seems it sounds better anyway. The first one's just Thai. Dr. Ali Ataie, however you wanna, he can actually tell us how he pronounces it. He's a scholar of biblical hermeneutics with field specialties in sacred languages, theology, comparative theology, and he's at Zaytuna College. He teaches Arabic, creedal theology, comparative theology, and he teaches about the Qur'an and ancient texts. He's written his book, which is I'm just going to read the full title.
It's his PhD dissertation.
Yeah, it's his PhD dissertation.
2017 published.
2017?
It was, he got his degree.
Okay. So the title of it is Authenticating the Johannine Injil, Sunnite or Sunni, Polymerenic Interpretive Methodological Approaches to the Gospel of John. And that's the title, it's quite a mouthful. Now, in this book, he focuses on the Gospel of John, as the title suggests, arguing that the Gospel of John is the preserved Injil, which the Qur'an is, or which we can use to show that, or we can use certain passages from the Gospel of John, certain parts to show that it is the preserved Injil, the authentic Injil that was revealed to Isa alayhi salam.
Yeah.
Now he in the title, so just so we know, he goes through he mentions this term polymerenic.
Yeah.
And he actually in the book he talks about 3 different approaches to the Bible. Could you give us a breakdown of them in your esteemed summary?
So so about Dr. Professor Ali, right, I would say is that so he's in Zaytuna, yeah. This is in 2017, and then a couple of years later, there's a podcast where he kind of comes on Mad Mamluks.
Okay.
He kind of affirms the content of this.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard, because he's got a lot of long form content online.
A lot of lectures.
A lot of lectures, very detailed, and it's very hard to get through all of them, right? But it's very interesting. The guy really knows his stuff. Right? When it comes to the Bible, I've seen very few Muslims that are this much well versed, where even the knowledge of the Hebrew, the Greek, right? He has knowledge of the language itself, so he's directly engaging with the language. I've seen very few Muslims, engage that seriously with Christianity the way he has. So whenever you listen to him, there's a lot to learn from it. And then I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, he did another a lecture in Zaytuna, where he also mentions the view of the preservation of the Injil bin Injil, and it's about the crucifixion. And he has his take on the crucifixion. But that being said, in the last year or so, some of the more recent
podcasts that he's done. I've not listened to all of them, but I can just try to listen for this purpose, a significant amount. He does seem to have not openly retracted from this, but the position he's advocating is different now, where he's actually much more critical of the Bible as of the Gospels as being actual history. He's much more critical of the writers of the Gospels, and actually far more critical of Paul as well, where he's actually more positive about Paul and more negative about Paul as well now as St. Paul. And the way he's kind of done history is far more different. So I don't know if that's a development, etc. Right? So what I'm going to say here, just to be very fair, is that I'm critiquing the ideas that are found in this dissertation. If the professor holds those views, then it's a critique of the professor. If he doesn't, then alhamdulillah, there's no problem, right? We're on the same page, and then everyone's happy, right? So, and if it's like a recent development of the professor, then I think maybe he can. It'd be nice to just for me to share my ideas on this, and then of course, if you agree, then great, right? And so I'm not in any way, downplaying the knowledge of Dr. Ali when it comes to Christianity in any way. That's not my, it's not my field. That's his field, far more knowledgeable. But there are certain points I think about methodology and about certain viewpoints that he's advocated, which I don't think are correct. And there's other things that he said, like on this point, which I think is very useful. So this idea of a polymorenic interpretation is a term that he uses to refer to a polemical, which is a much more what he calls warlike.
Yeah.
So is what we were referring to at the beginning of the podcast, which is that the Muslim-Christian engagement has been far more warlike, where we're trying to battle you. And he gives the example of Ahmed Deedat, who's one of the, rahimahullah, is one of the, in the forefront of refuting Christians. And he actually, Ahmed Deedat had all these pamphlets that he wrote. And these pamphlets he put together into one book. I've got this book, it's called The Combat Kit.
Yeah.
So it's this book that you're supposed to hold, and you go and you get any Christian, you come and you refute it. And it works most of the time, to be honest, right? So if you were to go to your lay Christian and use those arguments, it would be quite effective.
Speaker's corner.
Maybe not anymore. I think people may have, I don't know what the case is right now, right? But it would have worked in the past. I'm still sure it probably would in some places. So it was called The Combat Kit. So he goes, this is polemical. So he's using polemical in a negative sense. It doesn't have to be, but that's his use. It's no problem. You can, as long as you're consistent with your terminology. A polymorenic interpretation is far more sympathetic, right? It's for academic rigor.
What was the other side of the spectrum? Because
I believe it was, he mentioned it, I can't remember right now what it was.
But there was this other side, which is like a total, not a total, but a very sympathetic use of the Bible. That's like advocating that it's valid source, etc.
Yeah, and I think it even affirms the interpretations, and and I think Qur'an has to be mixed, changed in accordance with that, something like that. I think it was. I can't remember, but it's not something that's really engaged in. This is not trying to engage that.
The point is so that because he comes up with this middle approach. It's an amalgamation of this
100%
approaches, right?
So that's the thing. Now, first we want to praise, right, about this type of endeavor, is that he's doing something which is not done before, or I've not seen many people do it before, which is to take to do a study or commentary of the Gospels from people who are from the original language, engaging with the commentary tradition of the exegesis of the Christians, and providing a Muslim position on it. There's not much precedent for this. So therefore, when people are engaging with such kind of topics, and also when it comes to the preservation of the Bible, the Qur'an talks about tahrif of the Qur'an, that the Christians and Jews engaged in it, but there's no explicit mention of exactly who did it and how it was done.
This is something that he makes mention of in the book. So he says that it's one of his arguments around the Gospel of John is that explicitly the Qur'an talks about the Yahud doing tahrif, but the Qur'an doesn't explicitly rebuke the Nasara, the Christians, for doing the same tahrif that the Jews did. He uses that kind of tone. So he's kind of he sets his foundation that to then build on, right?
So we can respond to that as well, inshallah, right? But the problem with the issue is that when you are the first one going down a route where there's not much precedence, then it's much more easier to make errors, all right? Because there's not much precedent to work off. So therefore, you have to be sympathetic to the one who goes into such an endeavor. So this is like, I'll give you an example. So when you want to say that, actually I'll give you a better example, right? Is you have something which is called nadari and tatbiq, right? So nadari is a theoretical and tatbiq is application. So if, for example, you want to say that the Qur'an is affirming the Injil and the Tawrat, right, and the Zabur, then, and you want to make a theological case because the Arabic words of Qur'an say this, and Suyuti said this, and so-and-so said this, or Biqa'i said this. So then, if you're affirming that as being revelation, according to the Qur'an, then fair enough, the ahkam are mansukh. So for the hukm comes, you don't have to take it. But the khabar have to be believed in. So sometimes a person may come up with a theory, but they don't necessarily know what the lazim of that theory is.
Yes.
Right? What the theory necessitates. So as I said before, if I say that the first 5 books of the Bible is the Torah, the Quran is referring to is affirmed by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the lazim of that I have to affirm what? The story of Lut.
Yeah. You have to do the tasdeeq of them and then try and explain them. That whole job is yours now.
But if I haven't, right, then my position doesn't mean much then, because it shows that I've not done what? Istiqra.
Yeah.
I've not actually studied the text completely and actually highlighted what my position is. If I've not done that, then my position doesn't hold much weight. So if Biqa'i or if anyone like Ghazali was apparently on this view, then until they explain to us their view of Ismatul Anbiya now, and they actually have to explain that the problematic passages here, the view doesn't mean much, right? Because it can just be what? Another review, a theoretical view says, you know what? Maybe it's preserved, just humanistical distortion. It doesn't mean much if that's the case, right? But the reason I'm saying this is because he's trying to provide an argument, and it's interesting, something that we can engage in. But because he's the first, he's going there, I think a lot of errors are made when you're the first one to kind of open up this kind of commentary tradition. So the way I would change it, if it was just changed a little bit, I think it could, even if he changes his view, right? I still think it can be something that can be worked off. What you do, and I'll explain why as well after, right? Is that you say, the Gospel of John is not the Injil the Quran is referring to. It's not the Injil, right? As we mentioned, the Gospels are explanations, accounts of the life of Jesus by later people.
By inspired individuals.
Yeah. So what we would say is that this is an account of the life of Jesus that Christians believe it to be true. Christians believe that this Gospel, right, has affirms the divinity of Christ. So this Gospel affirms the divinity of Christ. I can show you by my form of tafsir of the Gospel of John that it's not saying that at all. If now they want to refute, no problem. None of that will come back to the Qur'an. Why? Because we've not affirmed it as being the Injil. So for example, if I have a debate with you about whether the Gospel of John affirms the divinity of Christ or not, and someone as a Christian refutes me and I get refuted, it means nothing to Islam. Why? Because I don't believe it's the Injil in the first place. Right? I believe it's an account of the life of Isa alayhi salam, where this person uses this kind of terminology which may suggest divinity and may not. I think it doesn't. You may make a better case. Okay, no problem.
So the question then arises here, and this is something which also is asked in polemics as well, that if then you don't take a position on it in the sense that it's not the Injil, right? Or you take the position that it's not the Injil, then doesn't the exercise become fawda? Like it just becomes meaningless in the sense that you're trying to exercise interpretation on something you don't even believe is the Injil, right?
Right. But that's the thing, was that we're trying to demonstrate through this exegesis is that even if you to accept the text as being divine, your belief is still not accurate.
Okay.
Right? You're still inaccurate in your belief of what you hold. You see, he mentions here, quite rightly so, let's get to the thing, right? And we go through some of the mistakes, I believe, as well, right? Is that he argues here that Muslims are engaging with non-Muslim historians of the Bible. So famously, people like Bart Ehrman, James Dunn, right? Figures that I've read. And they, what they argue for is that why is it in the Gospel of John, out of all the Gospels, right? Is that if you were to look at the famous dating amongst historians of the Gospels, is that they say the earliest Gospel is the Gospel of Mark. Then you have Matthew and Luke who utilize Mark because they have identical passages cited from Mark. And then they have identical passages from another source, which is known as the Q Gospel. So we don't actually have, but the citations to it. And then you have the Gospel of John, which is the latest Gospel. And you have something which is known as Christology. You have low Christology, high Christology. Low Christology is just being much more of a man, and high Christology is just being much more godlike. And what you see, these scholars argue, is that at the later you go in the gospel tradition, the more godlike Jesus becomes. So by the time you get to the Gospel of John, that's where all these divine claims come in.
Yeah.
So what Professor Ali in this dissertation argues is that no, we don't want to accept their critique. Because right now Muslims have been accepting this critique, and I think Professor Ali now takes this critique again, is adopted as well, is that what was happening in the Gospels is that there is over time period, there's Jesus becoming more divine-like, and then by the time you get 120 years later, he becomes part of the Trinity. What the Qur'an is saying is, and as most historians would affirm now, is that Jesus most likely never claimed to be God. Just a historical point. Of course, he didn't claim to be God, right? But historically, he most likely didn't claim to be God. And so therefore, the later you go, the more godlike he becomes. It shows that there is that's tahrif taking place.
Yes.
So the Quranic tahrif would be this overdevelopment of the Christology of Jesus. Now, I'm to mention how usually Muslims approach it, right? So then what are the Gospels? And what is the Injil? The Injil is, as the Quran affirms, revelation to Isa alayhi salam. And then the Gospels are written by later individuals who write accounts of life for Isa alayhi salam. So when this person in the, let's say 70 years, 60 years, 80 years after, like there's not dates for this, right? But rough dates, is writing this biography of Isa alayhi salam, what is he going to be doing? He's going to be asking people, what did you hear? Or there'll be stories. And then based upon those accounts, he will write that down. Now, once they're writing those down, wouldn't elements of what Isa alayhi salam spoke be found therein?
Yes.
That's the Injil.
Yeah.
Right? So we'll find remnants of Injil, and then we'll find other things in there as well.
Yeah.
Right? Remnants of Injil, and you'll find other things therein as well. Now, if you're claiming, as he's claiming, that these later individuals were mulham, that's the term he uses, that they were inspired beings. So therefore, their revelation is revelation. That's firstly, there's nothing in the Quran that suggests that. So when he says the ayat of the Quran, what's the verse he says? وَأَوْحَيْتُ إِلَى حَوَارِيِّينَ. I think he's referring to that verse, right? Because I revealed to the Hawariyin. There's no evidence that wahi was referring to the Injil. It's nothing to do with the Injil in that place, right? So if you're saying that this is what the Injil is because these are inspired beings, right? Then the Quran has to say that the revelation didn't come on Isa alayhi salam. It came upon who? This guy called John, Matthew, Mark, Luke. And that's unprecedented in history.
Yes.
In terms of Muslims. What you would have to say is that parts of the Injil are preserved within the Gospels. And then the prophetic, you said, but that's like, you're basically saying whenever it affirms the Quran, then you accept it, you don't accept it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
He used it as a negative point. But yeah, because that's what the Prophet says.
Yeah. That's the prophetic guidance.
That's the prophetic guidance, is that we have our measure. Now, of course, polemically, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to a Christian and say, well, I don't accept that because the Quran doesn't affirm it.
Yeah.
So you have to form a more innovative arguments, right? But in terms of as our Aqidah, we would say, well, yeah, that's our principle.
Yeah.
If it coincides with belief, it doesn't, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So he's made an attempt to say the Gospel of John, which is the most highest in Christology, shows Jesus to be most godlike amongst the other Gospels, right? If read through the lens of what he calls theomystical tradition, which is a Sufi tradition.
Yeah.
About the idea where language is used of divinized beings.
Yeah.
Where a person reaches certain maqams, and so like there are certain hadith which talk about like the hadith of Allah Ta'ala becomes the sight of the person when they sees, and the hearing what they hear with. So they go, this is basically a person becoming godlike.
Yes.
These are istilahat or terminology that is used, which zahiran apparently may seem like you're equating yourself to God, but in actual fact, when explained, it's not that.
Yeah.
So these are these highly esoteric terminology that's used. He goes, because it's used in tasawwuf, where terms which are conceived as someone becoming godlike, rabbaniyin, Rabb-like, then the Gospel of John is actually a theomystical text. It's like a Sufi account of the life of Jesus.
Hence why when Isa alayhi salam refers to Allah as the Father and He's the Son, etc.,
yeah.
then those words can't be understood as being a literal father, a literal son. It means proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, closeness to Allah.
So we can affirm those words through the theomystical lens. That's fine. But the problem I have is you have other statements in the Gospels, the Gospel of John, which show Jesus apparently claiming to be God, and he's explained them all away.
Yeah.
Right? He's got the book of signs, the first part of the Gospel of John. He explains through all those passages. But the only concern I have is that what if a stronger case is presented for that to actually claim with divinity? That means that it becomes necessary for Muslims to engage with a preserved text.
Yes.
Because you're basically now telling me that there is the gospel. There's another 200 pages, etc., of revelation in the gospel in the Torah, and there's 133 pages according to this of the New Testament which are God revealed, preserved, and the Muslims have never engaged with revelation. We've got this preserved revelation here, hundreds of pages. If it's the whole Bible, that's bigger than the Qur'an in terms of size, right? Because when Abbas says that. The Messenger was asked, were you older than the Messenger of Allah? And he says that the Messenger of Allah was, so he was older. So he goes, Huwa akbaru minni wa ana asan. He was greater than me, but I'm older. So when we say he's bigger than the Quran, we be careful with the alfaz, right? So he's not greater than the Quran, but in terms of content, it's larger than the Quran. So that means if this is this is all revelation, all Allah has said all this, it's a major claim.
Yeah.
Right? So we should be, at least half a dars in Islam, we should be studying the Bible at least, right? I think we got our dars in Islam completely wrong.
Bible tarjuma.
Yeah. So anyway, the point being, yes, so that becomes a highly problematic, it becomes highly problematic if they can make a better case to say he's godlike, which is actually the dominant position of the historians right now, is that the Jesus in the Gospel of John is divine, some form of divine claim he's making. Whereas the Gospel of Mark, the older Gospel, is not divine, it's much more man-like. And you say, okay, by the time we get Jesus himself, it must be just a man, right? A Nabi, not just a man, but a Nabi. So that's some of the concerns with the thing. Now, more specifically, there's a number of citations that he's made to justify his view. So one of them, as you mentioned, was that did the Qur'an only affirm the tahrif of the Jews? And he refers to Suyuti. He goes that Suyuti in Jalalain mentions that all three of the above cited verses indicating textual corruption applies to the Jews, like Ka'b ibn Ashraf, the Ka'b and the Torah. And so if you go back to Jalalain, the part he says, he refers to the verse of the Quran, he says, wa inna minhum, Quran says, indeed from them. And then Suyuti says, ay ahlul kitab. Ahlul kitab is both. Then he says, la fariqan, Quran says, the Suyuti says, ta'ifatan, ka Ka'b ibn Ashraf. That's not takhsis of the Jews. He's saying the Ahlul Kitab, and then amongst Ahlul Kitab, Ka'b ibn Ashraf. So the idea that, and also it's important to know,
it's giving an example rather than
giving an example, is tamthil, right? And also you have to understand that in tafsir, you have what is known as ikhtilaf al-tanawwu' and ikhtilaf al-tadad.
Okay.
So you have differences in articulate. So I'll give you an example, right? Allah says in the Quran that for disbelieving people, يَقَوْمِ يَكْفُرُونَ or لَا يَعْلَمُونَ or whatever Allah Ta'ala will say about a group. So you open up a tafsir and it will say, Ibn Abbas said, يَعْنِي mushrikun. And then you say, Suddi said, the Jews. And then Mujahid said, the Christians. And it's like, which one is it? And this happens in every other verse. So Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah actually mentions this qaida. He goes that most of these verses, hardly any ikhtilaf. They're not tadad. They don't contradict each other because Allah Ta'ala can refer to both. If a person does takhsis of it, that's not takhsis to say it's hasar, that we're restricting this to one person, is giving that the siyaq seems to be referring to you, but there's no reason why I can't refer to that group as well.
Which is part of the beauty of the Quran, right?
It's a multi-layered facet of the Quran. So when you have these kind of verses, that's not to suggest that at all. He also cites Ar-Razi, and I don't believe he presents Razi's view accurately. You can check it. It's on page 3 actually. And then he cites from Ghazali in his Ar-Radd al-Jamil. Now the Radd al-Jamil is actually a similar thing that he's done here, where he tries to show that the Gospels do not affirm the divinity of Christ, and it's actually a theomystical interpretation of the Gospels to show that none of this affirms that Jesus is God, and it coincides with the Quranic Injil. Based upon that, the Radd al-Jamil of Ghazali, people have attributed to Ghazali the view that he believed that the Bible was preserved.
Okay.
Right? Again, there's nothing in the Radd al-Jamil which suggests this.
Okay.
But there's two problems here. Number one is that there's nothing in the Radd al-Jamil suggests that he believes that the Bible is preserved. And number two is that the attribution of Raddul Jamil to Ghazali is debated.
Okay.
Right? The attribution of Raddul Jamil to Ghazali is debated. The book has been published by Brew again in Arabic. It's got introduction by Mark Bauman and Maha Al-Kaisi.
Mm-hmm.
And they've edited and published the book. And they themselves do not accept the ascription of the book to Ghazali.
Okay.
The reason for this is that the earlier biographers of Ghazali don't mention this book as being one of his. But that being said, Biqa'i, in his risala that we've mentioned, mentions this risala of Ghazali and affirms it as his.
Okay.
So Allah knows best, right? If it is, then great. If it isn't, I don't think, whichever view you take, I don't think it changes the fact, because the risala itself, from my reading of it, doesn't suggest that Ghazali is affirming the textual integrity of the Bible.
What does the actual risala suggest then, in terms of, as opposed to affirming?
It's the same thing, saying that even the book that you have doesn't affirm the belief that you have.
Okay, same approach as...
The book that you have, this is a similar argument that Ahmed Didat would employ.
Yeah.
So his method was, of course, it wasn't as thorough academically in terms of citing the historians the way, and academics the way Dr. Ali is doing it, but it's a similar method of saying, well, your book affirms this about Jesus. Your book shows that Jesus is not God. And it shows you the remnants of the, because when Allah says in the Qur'an, this is one of the key verses that's used, it says, let the people of Injil, Injili, the people of Injil, govern by what Allah Ta'ala has revealed therein. So this is one of the key verses used to show the preservation of the Injil, because how can you do hukm by the Injil if you don't believe it's preserved? But Allah says, بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فِي, which Allah Ta'ala has revealed therein, which means that within this text, there is revelation of Allah Ta'ala. And if you look thoroughly and hard enough, you would see what Allah is saying within it.
Yeah.
And we're still on that same madhab.
Yeah.
We say if you read the Torah and you read the Injil thoroughly, and you take out all the assumptions and guessworks of latter historians or latter writers, and you try to see what Isa himself was arguing for or believing in, he was not advocating. So, for example, you have the story of the prodigal son, where you have the father who divides his son, asks for his share of inheritance. He takes it and he goes off and he lives a life of, gambling or drinking and all sorts, right? Sorry?
Debauchery.
That's the term, yeah. And so then thereafter he comes back to his father and he says, it's a story where he eventually repents, and his other son saying, well, I didn't do any of that. Why didn't I get any celebration? He goes, well, you always did. This guy came repented, right? That's a story of repentance. Is that in accordance with Christian belief of Jesus dying for our sins? No. That's not. It's a story of repentance and turning back to Allah so we can gain salvation. Yeah. It's got nothing to do with, I've done bad, right? Now that you die, right? It's got nothing to do with that. It's about me atoning for my, doing tawbah, and Allah Ta'ala forgiving me for it. Yeah. So I can point to and say, look, go to your Injil and you will see the idea of justice and tawbah within it, right? Jesus died on the, as you mentioned, as I said, Jesus claimed he was God, right? Jesus is eating. He's saying that, he's affirming that he's a son. He can't do anything without the will of God, of his father, etc. Right? He worships, etc. So we can find that in it. That's the meaning, and it makes most sense because the alternative meaning, the lazim of it, is bizarre. As I mentioned, the amount of revelation you have to then accept is significant. So that's the issue of Ghazali. So, and he says here, he goes, and that's why I mentioned the issue of Biqa'i. He goes, as the late Muslim exegete Ibrahim ibn Umar Biqa'i in his remarkable evangel diatastron or gospel harmony, Al-Aqwal Qawima, this is not a diatastron, it's a mistake. This is his work. The diatastron is a separate work.
Okay.
Al-Biqa'i believes that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John is the Injil, yet they, the Gospels, of what Watson calls the fourfold canonical Gospels, do not support the deity of Christ. There's nothing in it, Allah knows best, that affirms that he says it is the Injil.
Yes.
Right? So that's the point there. There's a bunch of other things as well. I'll go through as well. Any other questions on that? Or
I think that was quite clear. In terms of moving on to some of the other points that he mentioned, or some questions actually on some of the things that you mentioned as well. This kind of esoteric, metaphysical interpretations that he employs to then use. He obviously establishes that for the Qur'an, and then he also mentions it for the Bible. Do you find yourself agreeing with this method in the sense that do you think it's a plausible way of interpreting the Bible and by extension also the Qur'an, right?
I think with the scholarship here that's required, there's something which I think was the famous poet Muhammad Iqbal, Allama Iqbal. He would talk about group ijtihad. So rather than individual, you do group ijtihad. And I think a task like this requires a group of scholars. And I explain why. Is that the task is so hard. I'll give you example. I'm from a background of studying hadith, fiqh, Arabic language, etc. That's what we do, right? So when I'm speaking about a book like this, there's a lot of biblical studies in here. So I can break down to you the basic concept of the Bible. I can understand basic understanding of how historians view the Bible, but the actual nitty-gritty of it, I can't do. So I can give you the Islamic version of events to some degree, what Allah said, what the Messenger of Allah said. But if you want me to go and give you a breakdown of the Greek translation of a term, I can't do that, right? So if you want to do such a task, it's a mammoth of a task, but it requires multidisciplined, a person to be multidisciplined, and usually more than one person. And I think this is where the shortcoming in the dissertation is, that it's a very good job of highlighting how the Gospel of John's alternative reading Gospel of John, the theomystical interpretation says, and it gives plausible explanations for it. Great. He actually translates the Gospels himself and actually puts the word Allah and Isa and Yahya and stuff in there to kind of show a much more Islamic reading of it. But that being said, I do think that it's a bit strained when it comes to even explain the Sufi tradition. So like the bulk of the citations of the Sufi material, if it's from Ibn Ajiba, whether it's from Ghazali or Ibn Arabi, etc., a lot of it's from translations that he's citing. A lot of the hadith that he's citing, again, there's not much grading of it. It's debatable, it's disputable sources. So a lot of these, the material that he's using, right?
To establish his premises.
To say, this is what we're going to interpret as such. A lot of Muslims say, well, no, that's not even established from the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Right? So what would have been, as I said, it would have been better to make this as like an exercise. To say, okay, let's do it as like an experiment. If we take these terms, can we apply it? And if we can, then great, then we can build off it. But the significant claims that come with it, it seems that the knowledge of the Islamic tradition and the Islamic the ulama tradition is quite stretched. It lacks the depth. So it would have been better if there was a Muslim scholar who's much more well versed in the tradition to work alongside for this kind of project. You will come to much more meaningful conclusions. And it's a lot of the times where, because remember, when you're a person, a lot of the polemicists, those who engage in Christian and Jewish or comparative religion, you have to remember that when you're studying a comparative religion that has 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 year history, that's a massive task that you're doing. So trying to keep yourself well versed, as these scholars are doing, trying to keep them up to date with academia, etc., you have to really sacrifice your knowledge of the Islamic sciences. Right? It's very hard to keep top on both, right? I had to spend time reading this. I'm reading works of people and stuff, and it's a lot of time. But by me doing that, I have to sacrifice time that I'm doing my other reading of. So I do think that it's such a mammoth of a task that he's kind of struggled with the Islamic side of things. So yes, are there plausible explanations? Yes, but then was the Islamic side argued for strongly? Then no. And I'll give you examples. I don't want to just make claims and just leave it at that, right? For example, you have, he cites, for example, the hadith of Jabir, all right, radiyallahu anhu, which is the famous hadith which was attributed to the Musannaf Abdul Razzaq. And this is the hadith called the hadith of Nur, that the first thing Allah Ta'ala created was Nur from my Nur. Now, the hadith of Jabir, which I've spoken to you guys about before, is, so he says the following regarding the hadith of Jabir.
Do you have the page number for that?
Yeah, I'm just getting it.
Because I want to just... When I was reading this, I saw this and I was like, this needs to come up.
Where's it gone? Authentic from him, not that one. Oh, here we are. So it's on page 99. On page 99, he says, and of course, there is a famous and strong Hasan hadith of Jabir found in the Musannaf of the Yemeni Muhaddith, Abu Bakr Abdul Razzaq, in which the Prophet told Jabir, the first thing God created was the light of your Prophet from his light. So then in the footnote here, he says, according to Rashad Jamir, both Imams, Jalaluddin Suyuti and Ahmad ibn Sadiq al-Ghumari, rejected this hadith. Jamil considers this hadith to be fabricated, mawdu' and falsely attributed to Abdul Razzaq, as no isnad here in transmission can be found in his first narration. He says, however, although this hadith is fabricated, then many great scholars have declared its meaning to be sound and acceptable. And he quotes Imam Yusuf and Nabahani, the virtue of the Prophet and his nation. Now, the problem here is that it's a very difficult way of wording it, and it shows that there's not much awareness of the material. So, like, for example, he says, and of course, there's a famous and strong hadith, and then someone saying it's a fabrication. There's a reason why there's someone claims fabrication is that the sanad is sahih, Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani, but the problem is the sanad is that the hadith is not in Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani. So when he says sanad is not Abdul, no, it's not in the sanad of Abdul Razzaq, I mean the Musannaf doesn't have this hadith in it. So because of that, the scholars deemed it as being a fabricated hadith. So it just seems like we're on shaky grounds with it. So there's another part where he quotes Ibn Ajiba, and he cites a hadith as Ibn Ajiba says, this hadith is speaking about this. But he's actually referring to him saying, huwa mutakallam fi, the hadith is spoken about, meaning it's debate its authenticity. Right? There's examples of citations. So for example, on page 58, he says that so you have the hadith Hassan bin Thabit radiyallahu anhu, where he says that the Messenger of Allah says, verily God helps Hassan with the Holy Spirit. Right? If literally be spirit of holiness, but Holy Spirit. The Qur'an declares in several places that Jesus was helped by the Holy Spirit. The latter, in my view, is a reference to the divine inspiration received by the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, through the Ruh Qudus, which is the Ruh Qudus, basically God's spirit of inspiration, helping Jesus in the sense of preserving his words, or at least the essence of his teaching, and probably not a reference to Gabriel, Jibreel, as most commentators, including Suyuti, contend. The latter opinion would seem to render Hassan a prophet, which is unacceptable according to traditional prophetology in light of Qur'an 33:40. Interesting, the only occurrence of the verb awha, and that's a separate point, right? So here, but the hadith Hassan bin Thabit, with the Ruh, so the reading, why are they saying Ruh al-Qudus is referring to Jibreel alayhi salam? Is because, again, if you read the hadith, you have to read the different versions of the hadith. So in Bukhari, the other version of the hadith has it as such, where the Messenger of Allah says to Hassan bin Thabit, saying his poetry, says, Uhjuhum wa Jibrilu ma'ak. So it's very explicit. Jibreel is with you, so therefore Ruh al-Qudus is Jibreel. So the two connected quite easily. So it's not just an interpretation. It's from the prophetic hadith with authentic prophetic hadith, right? And there's many examples of this where I sense that there is a, like for example, he cites Qurtubi on page, again, same page, sorry, just below that. So he goes, in fact, Qurtubi mentions several opinions regarding the Quranic phrase Ruh al-Qudus, and at one point equates it with the Injil itself, thus identifying as Jesus' revelation. Then Qurtubi does tarjih against it. So he doesn't mention Qurtubi's own tarjih, which goes against it. And again, in these kind of tafsir works, you're entertaining all ideas, right? So you say, Fulan said this, I heard this, whatever, right? And then you give your tarjih. So unless you can do istinad, they say this goes back to this person, or this is held by this person, then fair enough. But to kind of leave it like this, it just shows, I'm looking for a good word, where there is it will be basically me trying to engage with biblical studies, right? Is that I could say the names. So I said Bar Ehrman. I can say, I can understand what's going on, but me trying to engage critically with it by myself, I will struggle. And the Islamic case, I don't think has been made too strong. There's a number of hadith that I've highlighted, or places where I think that there's poor referencing. So he cites, for example, he goes, Imam Ali said, كان الله كان الله ولم يكن مكان. وهو الآن كما كان. So Allah existed when there was no space, and He is as He is. Ali is not affirm. This is not affirm Ali anhu, and the referencings are dubious, right? And so on and so forth. Another example, right? I just want to give examples for not so that anyone can think that I'm just for the sake of criticizing, right? In the section of the crucifixion, right? He, although now in his recent podcast, the Professor Ali, he argued that the Qur'an doesn't affirm the crucifixion. Doesn't affirm the crucifixion. Whereas in this work and his Zaytuna lecture he did a few years back, he was open to the idea of what it means is that وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ is that they did not kill him. Meaning the one who actually kills Allah Ta'ala. It's a metaphysical. So for example, I stab you and you die. Well, you only die because Allah caused you to die.
Yeah.
I didn't kill you. So yes, he was on the cross, he died, but it was actually Allah that caused him to die.
Okay.
So that was a theory that he entertained in here and he entertains there. And a lot of this is taken from a work by a guy called Todd Lawson.
Okay.
Right, Todd Lawson wrote a book on this crucifixion. I think this is a book that I read parts of, and I think it's highly dubious, some he's referencing. So one of the ways, for example, he goes that he cites from Todd Lawson on page 312. He says the following. He says, although there are traditions, so this is talking about the traditional narrative that Isa Islam went on the cross and they were substituted.
Okay.
Someone else, sorry, he didn't go on the cross, sorry. Someone else went on the cross, not Isa, made to look like them. And again, by the way, from a prophet, there's no prophetic hadith explaining the story. We just know he didn't die. He was not killed, he was not crucified. So you want to make an interpretation around that. There is ibham there, right? So no problem. But the question here is the point I'm mentioning here is something slightly different. Is saying that did Ibn Abbas actually say this?
Okay.
Right. So he goes, although there are traditional attributes Ibn Abbas and Wahb Munabbih which support the substitution theory, which is a traditional theory about this.
Yeah.
The former's tafsir, Tanwir al-Miqbas, has many questions of authenticity, inverted commas. That's cited from Todd Lawson, The Crucifixion of the Qur'an. While the latter figure is often deemed as, and the latter figure, which is Wahb Munabbih, is deemed as an audacious liar.
Oh.
Wahb Munabbih is, and again, reference back to Todd Lawson. Then he goes, Lawson suggesting where this comes from. Well, yes, Tanwir al-Miqbas is not written by Ibn Abbas, that's not Ibn Abbas' tafsir. But the tafsir of Ibn Abbas about the story of Isa alayhi salam is not from just from Tanwir al-Miqbas. This is found in the Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba. It's found in the Sunan Nasa'i al-Kubra. And this has been authenticated by Ibn Kathir. So he goes, this is Sahih Ibn Abbas, that the story of the substitution is from Ibn Abbas.
Okay.
There's nothing to do with Tanwir al-Miqbas here.
Yeah.
Right? And the issue of Wahb Munabbih is a thiqarawi.
Yeah.
He was questioned by Israeliyat, no problem. But there was no attribution to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam here anyway. It's an Israeli report.
There's never clusters of
issues. So this notion that from Todd Lawson, yes, he was criticized for his Israeliyat, but I'm saying here is that him as an individual, the way he suggests here is wrong. So it's over-reliant on Todd Lawson on this explanation of it. Maybe now I saw him I haven't listened to the whole thing, but he seems to have, alhamdulillah, changed his view on this. But over here, this Todd Lawson reliance is quite problematic. That's some of the things regarding the Islamic, some of the references to the Islamic content here. And in terms of the preservation of the evidences that are cited for the preservation of the Gospels, how problematic it is. The second thing he does, which I think is interesting, and I think his position now that I heard recently is far more better, and it makes much more sense, is that Muslims, what he calls SMBs, I think, right? Standard Muslim Biblicists.
Yes.
SMBs, yeah. Standard Muslim Biblicists, he calls them. He goes that what they do is that they read critiques or historians that are critical of the Bible, and they mention those arguments. Like I mentioned the issue of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how it develops Christology, right? That's something mentioned by a lot of non-Christian historians, and some Christians, but a lot of non-Christian historians, and the dating of it. So, for example, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are unknown. We don't know who they are. Right? So if you're doing by the isnad standards, the majhul rawis, we don't know what the isnad is, so they don't tell us. So if you open up the Gospel of Luke, Luke goes, well, I heard other people writing Gospels, so I thought I could do it as well. But it doesn't mention who his sources are. So John is not John, Mark is not Mark, etc. And so in this work here, he says, well, we shouldn't be open to secular historians about the Bible, because if we apply the same principles to Islam, then it would actually diminish the authority of the Qur'an and Sunnah. I would say in response to that, and I think this is his position is right now, and I think you would agree, so I'm just into the argument of him, right? Is that, yes, there are some premises that non-Muslim historians and non-Christian historians will work off that we can disagree with. So for example, if there's a miracle, so let's say the virgin birth, they will say the virgin birth historically most likely didn't happen, probably an invention. And we say the Qur'an affirms that we affirm it, right? But that doesn't mean that any historical analysis they do, so things that we can see with our own eyes. If you look at the Gospel of John, which is the latter Gospel, and the Gospel of Mark, and just two people just read it, you think there's a totally different Jesus. If Jesus is, for example, saying I am statements, which is I am God apparently, and he explains that away, right? He's saying I'm God, as Christians claim, then why don't we have it in the earliest sources, right? So that kind of claim, we can look at it, that makes sense. And if someone said that about the Messenger of Allah, about hadith, we will also accept it as well. If there's a hadith saying something, you know, like the
Outlandish.
hadith al-Nur,
Yeah.
right? It's like he's created from the Nur of Allah Ta'ala,
Yeah.
and no one seems to know this, the authentic. That's a question mark for the authenticity of a hadith.
Exactly.
So we apply those methods as well to hadith.
Mhm.
The Quran is different. The comparison of the Quran to the Bible is very different. You see,
Yes.
because we're talking about accounts of the life of Isa alayhi salam.
Mhm.
The Quran is not an account of the life of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yeah.
It's direct revelation that tilawatan is wahi.
Yeah.
So everyone's reciting it together. So it's a very different type of thing. And then in the early Christian history, you have 12 disciples that go off,
Mhm.
right? The Quran, and so therefore they're trying to spread the message,
Mhm.
right? The Quran, when the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passes away, you have thousands and thousands of millions of Muslims.
Mhm.
So therefore, you don't have the concern of tahrif and how there's enough people there preserving it. And then you have individual people citing as part of the puzzle, and they all coincide.
Mhm.
So therefore, we have a preserved message of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And also, the debates that we have are not the core aspect of Islam. You don't have, oh, the Khawarij believed in two gods, na'udhu billah, right? No, we're talking about a'mal, mukhrij millah or not.
Yeah.
Murji'ah, is amal iman part of iman, is amal part of iman or not?
Yeah.
None of them are saying whether Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is God or not.
Yeah.
Whereas the Christian history has differences on foundational belief about the
Yeah.
person of Jesus.
Yeah.
So it's not comparable.
This
the
is
two.
going into this discussion of applying biblical studies on the Quran and
Yeah.
Islam in general, right? And certain Orientalists, Christian polemicists have tried to do that, to try and discredit Islam and the Quran, etc. But even you've touched upon it as well right now, but just so it's clearer that even the method of preservation of the Quran, like you mentioned, the way it has come to us, all of that is completely different to the Bible. And I think here is where this aspect of isnad is so big for us.
100%.
That the isnad that we have, where a person who's a hafiz, he has an isnad from him to his teacher, all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, Jibreel alayhi salam to Allah, that isnad of hifz of Quran. And then with the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, is much more rigorous. And as opposed to the unknown writers of the Gospels and those who were divinely inspired to write those Gospels. We know these people, every single one of their names, their teachers' names.
And if we don't know,
Mhm.
we discard it.
Exactly.
That's what it is. If it's a hadith, we don't know, we discard it. So I think this is something that he takes on now.
Yeah.
But like one of the arguments that he makes in this book is like the Quran, it seems to affirm some of the stuff that happens in the Gospels.
Mhm.
Like the Gospel of John will talk about him bringing someone back to life with the will of Allah Ta'ala. So the Quran affirms that's affirming the Gospel of John. That's a strange argument. Why? Because the Quran talks about Isa alayhi salam bringing a clay bird and bringing life to it by the will of Allah Ta'ala. Right? That's not in the Gospels.
Mhm.
That story is not in any of the Gospels.
Okay.
That actually comes from what is known as an apocryphal Gospel.
Okay.
Right? These are basically other Gospels that didn't make it into the canon.
I see.
Right? So does that mean the Quran is affirming apocryphal Gospels? I said, no. The Quran is telling us what's true. It could be something which is apocryphal but may have picked up of a true information.
Mhm.
The Quran comes to tell us as a qadi, to say, this is right, this isn't.
Mhm.
Right?
It becomes essentially, how do you understand when the Quran talks about itself and says, مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنِ يَدَيْهَا, or لِمَا بَيْنِ يَدَيْهِ, right? That what is confirming what is before it, right? What does that mean? How do you understand that? Is what the Quran is affirming becomes the truth. So we measure the Bible that we have as they think it is, according to what the Quran is. And we say that it's not affirming the whole Bible, but what is mentioned by the Quran will be the truth. And if it happens to correspond with what's in the Bible, then you can say, fine, no problem. But anything that's not corresponded.
So it's one last point. We won't take too much longer, inshallah, right? How long are we going for?
5 minutes more.
5 minutes more, yeah. Okay. So, and I do get his concerns. Back to the original point about the citing of academics, right, that are not Christians. So we may not cite the same methodology on our text. And I get that. But then the problem you have is that if you're going to be citing pro-Christian or Christian sympathetic, like who are basically trying to argue for the Gospels of being a true account of Jesus, and you're saying that if you cite from non-Muslim academics or non-Christian academics, right, then you have a baggage to take on with it. Then you have the same baggage that goes this way as well. Yeah. So, for example, he cites from Craig Blomberg, right, who's a Christian historian who's written about the fact that the Gospels are a preserved tradition. But this same Craig Blomberg is a Trinitarian. He believes that not only the Gospel of John, but the Gospel of Mark affirm divinity of Christ. So then you can argue and say, well, if you're going to affirm him, why do you affirm that as well? He would turn around and say, the two are not necessary. So similarly, we would say, we can take critique of the academics against Christianity, just like Christians could do against Muslims.
Yeah.
So you want to affirm, for example, you want to say, oh, do you know there's this random academic who questioned the authenticity of the Qur'an? Go for it. But we're going to argue against the weight of evidence. So is there a strong weight of evidence of a development of Christology? Yes. Right? Is there a strong argument to say that the texts are quite late and the fact that the authors, we don't know who they are? Say yes. So if these are things that are true, they put a question mark on the text, which is something that he accepts now. I've heard him argue for as well now.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, right, you don't, as Muslims, you don't have to take a side. This is one of the things I think we kind of struggle with, right? And I think it's just a general point to end on this, inshallah, is that as Muslims, when we come into a discussion which we're not the ones that are making the original discourse, right? So, for example, in biblical studies, we are late to the party. The Christians are doing it, non-Christians are doing it, and they're going at it, right? Yeah. Then we Muslims come in and we've got our own thing to do. So we have to kind of align ourselves. So where Professor Ali now, I see, alhamdulillah, is amazing right now. He's a scholar of his own right. He doesn't need to align himself with everyone. But it does seem here that you have to try to align. Do I go with these kuffar that are completely, atheist and their take on Christianity, or do I take Christians that are closer to believe in God? And it seems here is more in line to take with the Christian side. And so we kind of have to see it ourselves to align ourselves with someone. But what needs to be done is say, no, we work on our own platform, right? And we don't, just like so you have sometimes, Muslims may cite what is known as the Jesus Seminar. And that's a group of scholars that study the Bible and their conclusions. But a lot of them, I think it's them, right? They don't believe Jesus existed.
Okay.
So then you have a problem. How am I citing them as evidence? So you have to be more academic in their way. So this polymeric attempt is stronger. I get it.
Yeah.
That you have to be more academic and rigorous in your method.
Yeah. And
he mentions a very nice part at the end where he mentions this. He critiques the Gospel of Barnabas that a lot of Muslim scholars will be citing over the last century. That this is a true gospel. And he shows how this is clearly not the gospel, is not approved at all. So this kind of honest scholarship is very important. So he brings that out. It just seems right now that this, when it was written, was, although well-intentioned, I think the idea of a preserved Injil is highly problematic. I mean, the Gospels are being the preserved Injil, or the Torah being preserved Torah, number one, has very little Islamic precedence. And if it does, it's not been worked through, where the necessary passages have been explained. This is the attempt to do so. But if that is the case, it's not, I don't think it's worked. And even the theomystical approach, which I get is useful, right? Like, for example, at one point, and this is what I mean by it goes against the prophetic guidance, is that because the Gospel of John affirms Jesus as being of the highest being amongst the children of Israel, that means he goes that, according to, if this is revelation, that means that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is first and Isa alayhi salam is second. Awul Anbiya. Qur'an never says this. Sunnah never says this. And this kind of goes completely against the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which is what? لا تصدق ولا تكذب. This is tasdeeq.
Yeah.
You see, right? So this is where some of the implications are. But it seems to be a task that he's done. And Allah reward him for his efforts. And I see the positions that he's held right now, his recent podcasts are very good. It's just for us to kind of participate in this. There's a lot of notes I've made, but I think we're going way over time. But hopefully with praise and, great, I think we end with the...
It would be good to see a development in this.
And I think it will be something forthcoming. He seems someone quite active, so he seems someone quite forthcoming. If someone asks the question of why do we ask the person before we don't, because it's books.
Yeah.
So if it's there, it's available. It's still on his bio.
Okay.
Right. This is still on his bio, so it's not like he's retracted openly. I haven't seen any retraction, so that's why we've kind of gone with it. But it seems to be ever developing. So this is a process of just to explain why we think this is problematic, this argument. Which is quite widespread. I heard a lot of people ask this question about the preserved Injil. Hopefully this has clarified that the arguments are quite problematic. The claims that I've made are quite problematic. Some of the citations of the Islamic tradition are quite problematic. But in terms of his actual exegesis of the Gospel of John, which is like the bulk of it, that's for the New Testament experts to deal with that.
Yeah.
Or those who know Greek. I don't know that. If it still looks like a good argument, right? But it's not something that I'll be willing to kind of put my egg in that basket, because I may go out and someone say, no, the Greek actually means something else, right? Because you have the famous passage in the Gospel of John, the first was the Word was God, the Word was God, and that Word is Jesus. Seems quite explicit, but he's explained it differently. fine. I can't get behind that because I don't understand the Greek myself, right? So, alhamdulillah.
So that concludes our episode. Jazakallah khair, Maulana Zishan, for the insights that you've given. We will put up all of the links. We'll put up the books, titles,
Names, not
the
links.
names, not the links, but the titles of the books that we discussed today, plus the additional works that Maulana mentioned throughout the episode, inshallah ta'ala. We would like for the viewership, for you guys to like, comment, subscribe, share the episodes, go back and watch our previous episodes, inshallah, and also mention in the comments or via email to us any suggestions that you may have, any books that you may want us to go through and review. Inshallah, they'll be very interesting to see from you guys what you guys think about that. And with that, I will conclude. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.